Get ready. Today, we'll take a journey into the past, but this won't be a leap of a few centuries or even millennia. We'll be diving billions of years back in time, to an era so ancient that no fossil records remain for study, and the planet's geography itself was completely unrecognizable. Let's travel back to a time when the continents were strange, alien landmasses. Air we couldn't breathe, water we couldn't survive in. Everything was different, and life itself, if life could be called that, remained largely hidden from view, invisible. And yet, it was in this silence and emptiness that fateful decisions were made that determined the entire subsequent history of our planet. Our destination today is the era known as the Proterozoic. Perhaps this word means nothing to you, and that's not surprising. You don't hear it in everyday conversation, it rarely graces museum posters, and it's barely mentioned in school textbooks. But its obscurity doesn't diminish its colossal significance. We talk about dinosaurs, we remember the Great Extinctions, but the Proterozoic era remains in the shadows. And yet, this period spans an incredible span of time. It began roughly 2.5 billion years ago and ended only 541 million years ago. Just think, more than half of Earth's entire history occurred during this era. If you compare the Proterozoic with subsequent eras, from the emergence of trilobites and the reign of tyrannosaurs to the present day, it seems like a long, drawn-out prelude to the true drama of life. But don't be fooled by this silence. It was a time of grandiose and turbulent events. The planet's surface was in constant flux. Giant continental plates crashed together, only to be torn apart again. The sky slowly filled with a new gas, oxygen, deadly poisonous to many of its inhabitants. These microscopic organisms, without asking anyone's permission, invented photosynthesis. Cells learned to unite and fuse with one another, laying the foundation for all the complex creatures that would emerge in the future, and for us too. Ancient stones, witnesses of that era, hold astonishing stories. True, they tell them reluctantly, almost in whispers. But if you listen closely, you can discern echoes of the first great ice ages in these geological layers. See traces of the first complex cells and the first experiments in creating multicellular organisms. These were the first timid hints that life would never be content with simple and small forms. If the Archean Eon was Earth's chaotic infancy, then the Proterozoic era was its slow, billion-year-long adolescence. Clumsy, full of drama and irreversible change. If you're ready, let's take this step. A step back to a time when the sun shone dimmer and the enormous moon hung much closer to the horizon. When the planet's days weren't 24 hours long, but several hours shorter. We're going to a world where neither animals nor plants yet existed. A world that hadn't yet fully grasped what it meant to be alive. To an era when Earth was just beginning to understand itself. Let's not rush. We have 2 billion years of history ahead of us. And it begins with a great awakening. By the beginning of the Proterozoic, Earth was already an old woman, many billions of years old. It had survived a vicious meteorite bombardment, and the first, most primitive forms of life had already emerged. The planet was shrouded in a thick, foggy atmosphere, a toxic cocktail of gases lethal to modern life. Oceans, of course, already existed, but they bore no resemblance to the sparkling blue expanses we know today. Imagine murky, lifeless waters with a distinct metallic taste. They contained no hint of oxygen, and therefore no trace of life as we know it. These ancient seas contained vast quantities of dissolved iron, which floated freely in the water column, coloring the oceans in some places an ominous rusty red. The dry land, the small portion of the planet that rose above the water, was bare, lifeless rock. No trees, no blades of grass, no fertile soil, no buzzing insects, no rustling leaves. Only the hum of the wind and the slow, silent work of geological forces. This world wasn't dead, but it was immersed in a deep, deafening silence. A silence that reigns where life has yet to find a voice, where it exists on a microscopic scale and is preoccupied with fundamental problems. By then, organisms consisting of just a single cell were already thriving, and they had been thriving for a very long time. Tiny bacteria and archaea, the oldest forms of life, discovered countless ways to survive in the most unimaginable conditions. They lived in boiling geothermal vents, in hypersaline pools, in total darkness, and in sulfur-saturated environments. These creatures were not graceful, but they were incredibly efficient. They slowly broke down minerals, absorbed some gases, and released others, and built microscopic structures invisible to the naked eye. And in doing so, without realizing it, they began to reshape their planet from within. The continents gradually took shape, though they didn't resemble those we see on maps today. Ancient supercontinents like Columbia and Nuna were slowly forming. Enormous slabs of land drifted across the surface of the mantle, pushed by powerful convection currents churning within the Earth's molten interior. Plate tectonics had already begun, but its work hadn't yet resulted in the creation of impressive mountain ranges like the Himalayas or the deepest ocean trenches. Instead, the land masses were predominantly low, flat, and covered in volcanoes. Erosion hadn't yet accumulated thick layers of sediment, and without plants to anchor the soil with their roots, any loose material was left to the mercy of wind and rain. Rivers already existed, but their courses were wild and unpredictable. Lakes formed in giant asteroid impact craters or in tectonic faults. Everything was more raw, more pristine. The elements acted directly, without the mediation of complex ecosystems. Sunlight certainly reached the surface, but it wasn't as bright as it is today. Our sun, in its early stages of evolution, emitted approximately 15% less energy. It would seem the planet should have turned into an ice ball, but this didn't happen. The secret lay in the dense atmosphere, supersaturated with greenhouse gases, primarily methane and carbon dioxide, which trapped precious heat. However, this atmosphere also had a serious drawback. It lacked an ozone layer. This meant that streams of deadly ultraviolet radiation rained down unimpeded from space, rendering the land surface completely uninhabitable. Life was forced to hide. Its refuge became the ocean depths, which served as a reliable shield from the deadly radiation. There, in the depths, safety, peace, and stability reigned. Meanwhile, the Earth's crust beneath the oceans continued to evolve. The formation of cratons, the ancient and incredibly strong cores of future continents, accelerated sharply during the Proterozoic. Cratons are the geological elders of our planet. Once formed, these massive deformation-resistant blocks remained virtually unchanged for billions of years. They became the foundation upon which the modern continents arose. For example, much of North America rests on a giant craton that gained its rigidity during that distant era. The same can be said for Africa and Australia. Their geological structure still bears the scars and imprints of billions of years of collisions, faults, erosion, and eruptions, a legacy of a time when the planet's surface was still struggling to maintain its integrity. One of the most important, albeit subtle, changes occurred deep in the mantle. Radioactive decay of elements in the core was the main source of the planet's internal heat. This heat triggered cycles of melting and recrystallization of rocks, facilitating the formation of new types of minerals. Granite became increasingly common. Elements destined to play a key role in the future development of life, such as phosphorus and molybdenum, were brought to the surface. At the time, these chemical elements didn't yet know that they would one day become part of enzymes or the building blocks of DNA. But their very appearance in accessible form already invisibly determined the future possibilities of biology. And so, in these ancient oceans, a true revolution was brewing. Among the countless species of microbes, one special group emerged that had mastered an entirely new, daring way to generate energy. These were bacteria, but they were unlike all the others. The ancient sulfur eaters and methane producers that dominated the planet had no idea what a competitor they had. These newcomers had learned to harness the energy of light, not just any dim glow, but the bright, unfiltered sunlight that penetrated the shallows of the ocean. With its help, they performed an incredible feat. They learned to split water molecules, releasing the energy contained within. But this process had a byproduct, an unusual corrosive gas, the likes of which the world had never seen in such quantities: oxygen. This became the starting point for one of the most dramatic and fateful events in Earth's history. But back then, in those distant times, it was just beginning. Tiny bubbles of oxygen, invisible and alien in these anoxic waters, slowly rose to the surface, carrying with them the message of coming changes. The world seemed to be dozing, but someone had already cracked a window, and very soon its atmosphere would never be the same. The oceans of the early Proterozoic were a world utterly alien to our imagination. Yes, there was water, and lots of it. Vast basins covered much of the planet, just as they do today. However, the chemical composition, color, and very essence of these ancient seas were completely different. These oceans were anoxic. This scientific word means something simple and terrifying. There was no free dissolved oxygen in the water. And this fact changed absolutely everything. Without oxygen, many biological processes we take for granted today were simply impossible. Respiration as we know it hadn't yet been invented. Instead, microbial life relied on entirely different, exotic chemical pathways. These organisms utilized sulfur compounds, produced methane, and utilized iron and nitrogen in ways that resembled laboratory experiments more than survival strategies. It worked, but it was extremely slow and inefficient. In those distant times, the oceans were supersaturated with iron, which was present in dissolved form. Modern seas contain very little of this metal because it instantly reacts with oxygen, oxidizes, and precipitates to the seafloor as rust. But back then, which ultimately led to the global glaciation we know as the Snowball Earth hypothesis. The disintegration of this ice shell, in turn, could have triggered the reverse process, a massive release of carbon dioxide due to ignited volcanic activity and the chemical weathering of fresh rocks. Imagine giant tectonic plates, those colossal chunks of the Earth's crust, slowly but inexorably grinding away at the very foundation of the planet. At subduction zones, like on a gigantic conveyor belt, ancient crust was sucked into the molten mantle, where it melted and was reborn. At mid-ocean ridges, conversely, new magma erupted from the Earth's depths, creating fresh ocean floor and pushing the continents apart. This eternal dance of tectonic forces constantly reshaped the face of our planet. Continents, like mythical titans, rose from the depths, their peaks reaching toward the sky. Then, millions of years of erosion mercilessly ground them to dust, only to rise again in a new cycle. This continuous geological cycle directly influenced life itself. It determined the abundance of vital nutrients such as phosphorus and iron in the oceans. When erosion destroyed newly formed mountain ranges, it released these elements, which then flowed through rivers into the seas, triggering a veritable explosion of biological activity. The connection between rock and cell, between geology and biology, reaches deep into the history of our planet. Mountain ranges altered the climate, influencing rainfall patterns, which in turn accelerated or slowed erosion. Erosion altered the chemical composition of the oceans, creating new conditions for their inhabitants. Crustal fractures, or rifting, created shallow seas and vast continental shelves, ideal cradles for nascent life. And the sinking of plates, or subduction, triggered volcanism, which released gases into the atmosphere, changing its composition. All these monumental processes were inextricably linked, even if their progress was so slow that for a single generation of living beings it seemed an eternity. To an outside observer, the Proterozoic world might have appeared frozen and immovable, but this was only an illusion. At first glance, these landscapes are desolate and serene. There are no forests, no animals, no familiar landscapes. But beneath this apparent stillness lurked a frenzied, indomitable activity. Continents clashed in titanic battles, drifted apart, only to reunite. Oceans were born and died. Mountain ranges rose to the heavens, only to crumble to dust. And so it went, cycle after cycle, again and again. Over time, these movements influenced absolutely everything, from the global climate to the paths of evolution. Even the sky above felt their powerful breath. Tectonics controlled volcanic eruptions, which, in turn, altered the chemical composition of the atmosphere. Clouds over giant supercontinents formed very differently than they do today. Wind directions shifted, and life, slowly and inexorably, adapted to these changes. The movement of the continents was not smooth and seamless. It left deep scars on the planet's body, faults and debris that geologists still find today. But it was continuous. The plates continue to drift today. The Earth's crust bends and stretches, but maintains its integrity, and the planet itself continues its endless journey of transformation. There, beneath the ice caps, in the ocean depths, in the chemical cauldron of shallow seas, life patiently bided its time. In silence and obscurity, it continued to evolve, preparing for its next great breakthrough. The atmosphere, like everything else in that distant Proterozoic era, changed painfully slowly. Its transformation affected not only its chemical composition, but also the planet's very rhythm. These changes could not be measured by clocks or seasons. Weather, as we understand it, did not yet exist. Instead, the planet operated according to different, extended cycles that lasted millions of years. These cycles were dictated by the advance and retreat of glaciers, tectonic shifts, and quiet biological revolutions that altered the air's chemistry, molecule by molecule. Above the microbial mats that covered the floors of ancient seas and above the drifting continents, the air alternately thinned and thickened, slowly heating and cooling. It gradually acquired the properties that would ultimately make the emergence of complex life possible. After the first bursts of oxygen that saturated the atmosphere with this gas, its levels did not begin to rise smoothly. There was no gradual ascent to modern levels. Instead, we experienced a series of sharp rises, long pauses, crushing drops, and new highs. It was not a smooth path upward, but rather a jagged and steep slope. Oxygen became a key player in this drama, but it was only one ingredient in the ever-changing recipe for planetary life. For incredibly long periods of time, oxygen levels remained comparatively low. They were higher than those of the Archean era, but far below what would have been needed by future animals. Scientists estimate that for most of the Middle Proterozoic, atmospheric oxygen levels were a tiny fraction of today's. It was sufficient to oxidize rocks and cause corrosion in soils, but catastrophically insufficient to support rapid metabolism or the growth of large organisms. This period is sometimes called the Boring Billion, not because nothing at all happened during this time, but because geochemical markers indicate long epochs of relative stability in the atmosphere and biosphere. It wasn't stagnation, but rather a very slow, almost imperceptible movement. Life evolved, continents drifted, oxygen was present in the air, but everything seemed muted, as if the planet took a deep breath that lasted for 1 billion years. However, even in this seemingly calm time, fundamental changes were taking place. The carbon cycle, for example, began to function like a well-oiled machine. Carbon dioxide emitted by volcanoes was absorbed through the weathering of rocks. Rain falling on the mountains reacted with silicates, and the products of this reaction washed into the sea and eventually settled on the seafloor. This process acted like a global thermostat. More weathering meant less carbon dioxide and lower temperatures. Less weathering meant more CO2 in the atmosphere and a warmer climate. Tectonics kept this system in working order, constantly pushing up new mountains and exposing fresh rocks to the erosive force. Biology also made a significant contribution. Microbial activity radically altered the composition of soils and bottom sediments. Methane, once the primary greenhouse gas, began to lose its position. Oxygen reacted with it, gradually removing it from the atmosphere. This change had colossal consequences for the planet's thermal balance. A methane molecule retains much more heat than a CO2 molecule, and its disappearance led to global cooling, which likely triggered the Great Glaciations. The atmosphere became a less dense blanket and responded more sensitively to geological processes. As oxygen levels rose, ozone became increasingly important. A protective ozone layer began to form in the upper atmosphere, the first shield in Earth's history from the sun's harsh ultraviolet radiation. This not only changed the spectrum of light reaching the surface, but also dramatically expanded the boundaries of habitable space. Before ozone, life was forced to hide. The planet's surface was a death zone. Ultraviolet radiation mercilessly destroyed organic molecules, making survival possible only in the deep sea or in shaded refuges. But thanks to ozone, these refuges were no longer the only refuge. New ecological niches opened up for life, first in shallow waters, and then, hundreds of millions of years later, on land. Sulfur was also an important player in this planetary theater. Volcanic eruptions released sulfur gases into the air, which transformed into aerosols in the atmosphere. These microscopic particles reflected sunlight back into space, cooling the surface. Over time, the sulfur cycle became increasingly complex as microbes learned to utilize various sulfur compounds in their metabolism. The isotopic traces they left behind in ancient rocks today serve as one of the best sources of information for scientists about the chemistry of the ancient atmosphere. Nitrogen, already abundant in the air, was also involved in this process. Biological nitrogen fixation, the process of converting atmospheric nitrogen into a form accessible to organisms, became increasingly widespread. This gave life access to a virtually inexhaustible source of building material, dramatically boosting growth rates, biomass, and the overall productivity of microbial ecosystems. This, in turn, led to the burial of more organic carbon, which ultimately contributed to the production of new oxygen. However, all this happened incredibly slowly. The atmosphere wasn't simply changing under the influence of life, it itself became part of life. Biological processes such as photosynthesis and respiration now constantly pumped enormous volumes of gases through themselves. As photosynthetic microbes proliferated, oxygen levels in the atmosphere rose. As organic matter decomposed, carbon dioxide returned to the air. And when tectonic shifts brought ancient sedimentary rocks to the surface, gases buried millions of years ago were reintroduced into the system. The same elements cycled endlessly between rock, water, air, and living cells. As a result of these processes, the atmosphere finally acquired its structure. A clear stratification into the troposphere, stratosphere, and other layers emerged. The boundaries between them, as we know them today, began to stabilize. Temperature gradients generated air mass movement, and stable winds emerged. Rain began to irrigate the Earth in the manner we are accustomed to, even though there were no forests, deserts, or hurricanes as we know them today. The atmosphere above Proterozoic Earth slowly took shape. It was never static. During periods of intense volcanic activity, the sky must have been clouded with ash and toxic gases. During ice ages, the air became clearer and colder. Occasionally, there were brief but powerful surges in oxygen levels. Let's fast forward to the twilight of the Neo-Proterozoic. Here, in this ancient world, the first timid harbingers of the coming revolution were already breaking through. These were only brief flashes, fleeting impulses, which nevertheless foreshadowed great changes, although they themselves were not long-lasting. Each of these waves of change left an indelible imprint on the planet's geological record. If we could peer into the layers of ancient rock, we would see this evidence: rusty layers indicating oxidation, subtle shifts in isotopic composition, and, of course, the fossilized remains of microscopic creatures desperately trying to adapt to new chemical conditions. And yet, despite these global shifts, life itself remained remarkably primitive. Imagine a world without eyes, without nerve endings. Not a single creature was yet capable of raising its head and meaningfully looking at the sky. But in the silence of the ancient oceans, and in the planet's very atmosphere, something momentous was brewing. The air was slowly, imperceptibly changing, becoming saturated with oxygen. It was not yet ready for complex life forms, but everything was moving in that direction. The great stage for the next act of evolution was almost ready to rise. And now, that moment had arrived. Deep underwater, among the bottom mud and sediment, individual cells began to perceive each other in a completely new way. They stopped seeing each other as merely a competitor for food. Instead, they saw them as a potential ally, a partner. Cells began to perceive themselves not simply as independent copies, but as part of something much larger. It may seem incredible, but for most of Earth's history, life got along just fine without what we call sexual reproduction. Yes, cells certainly divided, their DNA was copied and offspring were produced, but the entire process was asexual. One cell simply became two, two became four, and so on ad infinitum. It was an incredibly fast, efficient, and remarkably reliable way to procreate. For primitive bacteria and archaea, it was more than enough. And even today, the vast majority of living things on the planet reproduce this way. But somewhere in the mists of the Proterozoic era, a completely different strategy was born. It didn't replace the old one, no. It became an alternative, more intricate, slower, and riskier. But it was one that changed the rules of the game forever. The emergence of sexual reproduction wasn't some spectacular, dramatic event to be marked on the evolutionary calendar. The first such fusion left no fossilized traces. Two tiny cells simply exchanged fragments of their genetic code. This moment was unremarkable. It might have seemed pure chance. However, at some point, prokaryotic cells, the simplest of living things, mastered the trick of combining their DNA with that of another organism. And when they succeeded, they gifted evolution with an entirely new, incredibly powerful tool: recombination. In asexual reproduction, all offspring are essentially clones. They receive an exact copy of their parent's genome, with only tiny random mutations accumulating over time. But with sexual reproduction, things became much more complicated. Now, two cells contributed to the genetic material of the future offspring. Their chromosomes were shuffled, mixed, like a deck of cards, and assembled into entirely new, unique combinations. The offspring ceased to be copies, they became variations. And from an evolutionary perspective, variation is a priceless gift. The benefits of sex, viewed from a cold, genetic perspective, become clear. It creates incredible diversity, helps weed out harmful mutations, and allows entire populations to adapt much more quickly to a constantly changing world. It was a kind of insurance policy, a genetic resilience that allowed life to explore new possibilities far more quickly than random mutations alone could. However, this gift came at a price, and the price was high. Finding a suitable mate required time and energy. Only half of an organism's genes were passed on to the next generation, and errors in this genetic shuffling could be fatal. For such a risky strategy to pay off, the benefits had to be truly colossal. And apparently, in the slowly changing but chemically unstable world of the Proterozoic, this was indeed the case. The earliest forms of sexual reproduction were likely strikingly different from what we imagine today. It may have begun with a simple exchange of genes. Two cells might briefly fuse together to exchange sections of DNA, then separate again. Similar phenomena are still common among microbes, occurring through processes such as conjugation or transformation. Something similar may have occurred in early prokaryotes: the fusion of two nuclei, their mixing, and the subsequent redistribution of genetic material. It was this process that launched a new phase in the development of life on Earth. Over time, these random exchanges became increasingly organized. Meiosis emerged, a special type of cell division that reduces the number of chromosomes exactly by half. This allowed for the formation of specialized sex cells called gametes. When two such gametes fused, the full set of chromosomes was restored, but with an entirely new combination of traits from each parent. This basic mechanism still underlies the existence of almost all complex life on our planet. Sexual reproduction likely evolved alongside other major innovations, such as the emergence of complex organelles, the cytoskeleton, and cell signaling systems. Each new level of complexity opened up new avenues for interaction, coordination, and, ultimately, reproduction. Some of these ancient organisms may have switched between sexual and asexual reproduction depending on the conditions they found themselves in. Others likely already possessed specialized gametes of different sizes or with different functions. These were the first subtle steps toward the differentiation of males and females, steps that would have profound implications for the future of all life. This innovation allowed populations to explore a vast array of genetic combinations. This spurred natural selection, allowing beneficial mutations to spread more rapidly, while harmful ones could be hidden or completely eliminated. The genetic flexibility provided by sexual reproduction helped life survive the highly unstable conditions of the late Proterozoic. Global cooling, oxygen deficiency, abrupt chemical shifts, and tectonic catastrophes. Life survived all these trials, emerging with a new, more powerful set of survival tools. But beyond the purely genetic aspect, there was another, social dimension. Certainly not in our human sense. Sexual reproduction required interaction, the ability to recognize and be compatible with one's own. This pushed cells to develop new skills: communication, response to chemical signals, and synchronization of their actions. This cooperation laid the foundation for future, even more complex coordination, one that would become vital when cells decided to live not simply alongside each other, but as a single integrated organism. Fossil evidence of these ancient sexual relationships in prokaryotes is extremely rare, but they do provide some clues. Several large microfossils exhibit patterns of fission and fusion that clearly point to something more complex than simple division in two. Other fossils resemble modern algae, which often use both sexual and asexual reproduction. And molecular clock techniques, which use genetic differences to date evolutionary events, indicate that this occurred over 1 billion years ago, at the very heart of the Proterozoic era. We will never know which organisms were the first to undertake this risky experiment. We don't know what compelled them to take such a risk. But they left behind a legacy that will outlive every species. Every plant, every animal, every fungus on this planet owes its existence to that ancient decision, that chance fusion of two cells, that long-ago experiment in shared inheritance. And once it emerged, sex never went away. Even in species that later in evolution returned to asexual reproduction, the mechanisms underlying it often persist. They may be vestigial, dormant, but they are there. It is an eternal reminder that this was not just another quirk, but a true turning point in the history of life. Before this, evolution had followed a limited number of paths. Afterward, the number of possibilities multiplied exponentially. Not instantly, not explosively, but slowly, step by step, generation after generation. Life was still invisible to the naked eye. There were no flowers, no mating dances, no parental care. Only tiny cells drifting in primordial seas exchanged genes, creating ever new combinations. These invisible processes paved the way for a world that, as yet, contained no animals or any other creatures familiar to us. For billions of years, life was a solitary endeavor. A single cell was sufficient to survive on its own. It could feed, reproduce, and adapt to the world in splendid isolation. And this strategy worked flawlessly. It still works today. Judging by sheer numbers, mass, and metabolic activity, single-celled organisms still dominate our planet. But at some point during the Proterozoic era, some of these solitary cells decided to take a different path. They didn't simply divide and go their separate ways. They stayed together. They formed clusters, chains, films, and ultimately something far more complex. Thus, multicellularity was born. This transition wasn't instantaneous, and it didn't happen just once. It appears that multicellularity arose independently during evolution. in different groups of organisms, at least a dozen times, and perhaps many more. We see multicellular organisms everywhere, among algae, fungi, slime molds, animals, and plants. The idea of cells uniting into a single structure is not unique in itself, but the way this structure develops and becomes more complex, evolving into a coordinated organism with division of labor and coordinated growth, that is truly a rare and remarkable achievement of evolution. In the earliest stages, multicellularity was likely simply the result of cells not separating after division. One cell divides into two, but instead of drifting apart, they remain entangled. Some bacterial colonies still function according to this principle. For example, filamentous cyanobacteria form long chains in which different cells take on different roles. Some specialize in nitrogen fixation, others in photosynthesis. Even without a complex nucleus, these primitive creatures already demonstrate a remarkable propensity for cooperation. As multicellularity evolved, it took on ever new forms. Some cells began to form hollow spheres, others formed layered structures, and still others began to specialize in specific tasks. And once specialization emerged in this system, the advantages of such a union became undeniable. The advantages of this approach became increasingly clear. Imagine a team, each with its own task. Some cells are responsible for movement, pushing the entire community forward. Others transform into a living stomach, specializing in digesting food for everyone. And still others take on the most important mission of all, procreation. At this point, a living being ceases to be simply a collection of identical particles. It becomes something immeasurably greater, a single, harmonious system. However, establishing such cooperation was no easy task. Cells had to learn to communicate with each other, fairly divide the resources they acquired, and, essentially, enter into an unspoken agreement about who would play what role in this new community. They urgently needed internal laws and mechanisms to prevent anarchy. What if one rogue cell decided to grab more than its share? Or, worse, began dividing uncontrollably, causing chaos. It was these ancient forms of cellular self-governance that, over time, evolved into the complex systems we see today. The precise regulation of tissues, the strict control of growth, and even our immune system, which stands guard over order. Some of the first indisputable evidence of this revolution in the fossil record comes from microscopic fossils from the Proterozoic era. These are no longer just scattered individual cells. We see ordered, organized structures where all the elements are of the same size and shape. This is a clear indication of coordinated, collaborative growth. Some of these ancient fossils bear a striking resemblance to modern red algae. Others formed entire living carpets or thin threads of cells that, by all appearances, already performed various functions. Yes, these cells were tiny and primitive, but they had taken a crucial step. They ceased to be solitary. What was the catalyst that propelled life into this monumental transition? The answer, as is often the case, lies in energy. Long before, tiny power plants called mitochondria took up residence within eukaryotic cells. They enabled the production of far more of life's universal fuel, ATP, than their prokaryotic ancestors could ever have dreamed of. With such an abundance of energy, cells could afford the luxury of specialization. They could support their neighbors and participate in more complex collective processes. Of course, the emergence of mitochondria didn't make multicellularity inevitable, but it did open the door for it. Another crucial factor was the planet itself. Toward the end of the Proterozoic era, the atmosphere slowly but steadily became saturated with oxygen. This gas allowed cells to burn energy much more efficiently, which, in turn, became a powerful stimulus for their development and division of labor. Metabolism is the engine of life, and it is precisely this that allows for the maintenance of large body sizes. Thanks to oxygen, cells could now grow deeper, forming voluminous structures without experiencing energy starvation. Until this point, all life on Earth was forced to remain small, flat, or clustered in loose, short-lived colonies. Oxygen, penetrating into the very depths of the organism, made possible the emergence of true complexity. And perhaps fear played a role. The emergence of the first eukaryotic predators, capable of literally consuming others, created a completely new evolutionary pressure. A solitary cell floating in a primordial ocean had no defense against such an aggressor. But cells huddled together in a group, in a single lump, could prove too much for a predator. Uniting offered a chance for survival, and as soon as such primitive aggregations emerged, natural selection immediately began to favor more organized and coordinated versions. The development of genetic programming was a key breakthrough. In true multicellular organisms, body shape is not an accident or a side effect. It is encoded in their DNA, and cells recognize each other using subtle chemical signals. Multicellular organisms emerged thanks to the development of highly complex genetic programs that orchestrate their growth, division, movement, and formation. This required an entirely new level of control: the emergence of regulatory genes, signaling pathways, scaffold proteins, and a whole arsenal of molecular tools. However, not all multicellular organisms followed the path of increasing complexity. Many remained at the level of simple threads, films, or spheres, but some dared to go further. They began to build complex functional structures that allowed them to move together, feed together, and reproduce together. They didn't simply live next to each other, they acted as a single inseparable whole, and once this happened, evolution gained a completely new arena for creativity. Selection could now work on traits at the level of the entire organism, not just a single cell. Body shape, growth rate, reproductive strategy, all these became fields for endless experimentation. Organisms could become one another's habitats, transforming into hosts and parasites, predators and prey. This shift didn't mean that single-celled life had lost. Far from it. But it did vastly expand the horizons of what was possible. Multicellularity allowed life to reach entirely new levels, conquer previously inaccessible niches, and create unprecedented ecosystems. This became the foundation for all the astonishing diversity that would later emerge: sponges and worms, trees and fish, mammals, and, ultimately, ourselves. But let's go back to that distant era, at the end of the Proterozoic. None of this existed back then. The first multicellular creatures were microscopic inhabitants of ancient seas, invisible to the naked eye. They couldn't swim, couldn't sense their surroundings, and certainly weren't intelligent. And yet, they accomplished something incredible. They learned to cooperate. It was one of the greatest steps in the history of life on the planet. They decided to no longer act alone. Toward the end of the Proterozoic, the world began to change. These changes weren't sudden, like a lightning strike, but their consequences were colossal. After nearly 2 billion years of relative calm in the world of single-celled organisms, the fossil record suddenly begins to reveal something new. We see the outlines of creatures that speak not just of a cluster of cells, but of a well-thought-out structure, organization, division of functions, and, it seems, even of a design. These organisms weren't yet animals as we know them. They had no bones, jaws, or eyes, but they were larger, more complex, and undoubtedly alive. This astonishing period in Earth's history is now known as the Ediacaran, or Vendian period. The Ediacaran biota and its strange inhabitants remain one of the most fascinating mysteries in the history of life. The rock slabs that preserved their imprints date back to a relatively short period of time, approximately 635 to 540 million years ago. It was a time of great change. The last global ice age, which had frozen the planet, had come to an end. Glaciers retreated, atmospheric oxygen levels rose, and the ocean finally became suitable for larger organisms. Water chemistry also changed. New nutrients washed off the continents fertilized the seafloor, setting the stage for the emergence of unprecedented life forms. Fossils found in Ediacaran deposits are unlike anything alive today. These creatures had soft bodies, without any hint of a shell or skeleton. Many resembled flat quilted mattresses, likely lying motionless on the seafloor. Others resembled the leaves of strange plants or flat discs. Some were completely static, while others may have been capable of slow movement. They left behind only faint ghostly traces in the ancient sandstone layers. These imprints of living forms, preserved by silt and microbial films, resemble mysterious patterns on an old carpet. We still don't know what most of these creatures were. Some scientists suggest they were the very first primitive animals. Others believe they belong to an entirely separate, now completely extinct, branch of the tree of life, a sort of failed evolutionary experiment. Perhaps some were early representatives of the cynidarians, distant relatives of modern jellyfish and corals. Others may have been giant single-celled organisms or complex colonies. None of these creatures possessed truly complex organs. Only a few show hints of a mouth, digestive tract, or sensory organs. Nevertheless, a remarkable order is evident in their structure. Some fossils exhibit clear bilateral symmetry, like most modern animals. Others are built on the principle of radial symmetry, like starfish. It is speculated that some of them may have grown vertically, rooting in the seafloor like underwater plants. The size of these creatures is a mystery in itself. It varied greatly, but some specimens reached a meter in length, which was simply gigantic by the standards of that era. They lived on so-called microbial mats, those multi-layered bacterial communities that dominated the planet for billions of years. But now these mats played a new role. They became the stage for the first drama of multicellular life. Ediacaran creatures lived directly on these mats, perhaps feeding on them or absorbing nutrients directly from seawater. In many cases, we find no obvious evidence of their feeding. Perhaps they relied on osmosis, passively absorbing dissolved organic matter with their entire bodies. It's incredibly difficult to say with certainty. Some of these creatures slowly crawled along the seabed, perhaps using primitive muscle contractions or the coordinated movements of their cilia. The ancient seafloor has preserved traces of their movements. These are shallow, winding tracks pressed into the soft mud. They reveal neither the panic of pursuit nor the haste of flight. They indicate only leisurely movement, perhaps in search of more plentiful food sources. Clearly, these organisms were active creatures. They were not just larger than their single-celled ancestors, but also incomparably more organized. Their bodies were not a random accumulation of cells. They formed according to a specific developmental program, in which cells specialized and tissues acted in concert. These were no longer theoretical possibilities, but actual living experiments that left their traces in stone. They represent a crucial intermediate stage in evolution, yet they still elude our full understanding. Only a few of them show signs of reproduction. We know even less about their internal structure. They had no skeletons, no teeth, no eyes. They don't fit neatly into any of the later evolutionary lineages. Some seem to have vanished without a trace at the end of the Ediacaran period. Others may have been the ancestors of the animals that produced the famous Cambrian explosion. However, the direct connections between them remain elusive. Studying them is like flipping through a photo album of a long-vanished civilization. We recognize the familiar contours of life, yet at the same time feel as if every detail in this world is alien to us. The world around them was also changing. Oxygen levels were higher than ever before, but still significantly lower than today's levels. The planet was preparing for a new act in the great drama of evolution. Imagine a world where atmospheric oxygen levels were so low that they could barely support life as we know it. A world only just emerging from the icy grip of global glaciation. Fast forward hundreds of millions of years. Here, in the ancient oceans, a delicate balance had been established. Waters enriched with minerals that had leached from ancient rocks over centuries became a cradle for nature's new experiments. Life was still represented primarily by microscopic forms, but now the picture had become more complex. distinct layers emerged, divided by access to light, oxygen, and nutrients. As if in a giant multi-story building, each species occupied its own floor. The struggle for survival was still primarily a chemical, invisible war for resources, but now new factors came into play. Space, habitat, and the very shape of an organism's body began to play a decisive role. Where you lived and what you looked like now mattered. The communities of enigmatic Ediacaran creatures didn't resemble the crowded reefs of today. Paleontological finds paint a picture of a world free from crowding and bustle. Fossil beds reveal a modest diversity of forms that rarely overlap. Each creature had its own territory, its own little world, and the seafloor remained untouched, without a single burrow or trace. It was a quiet, almost silent era, but the biosphere didn't stand still. It experimented, creating bizarre, previously unseen life forms. And then, about 541 million years ago, this strange world began to fade. They didn't vanish overnight. Their demise was a slow, gradual process. One by one, their bizarre forms were erased forever from the face of the Earth, giving way to entirely new creatures. And these new masters of the planet left behind different traces. Burrows in the seabed, trails, and the first hard shells. These were signs of the arrival of active, mobile creatures whose inner complexity was far more important than their outward appearance. The Ediacaran creatures did not fall in brutal battles. They likely had neither predators nor prey as we understand them. Perhaps they were simply displaced, like an old technology being displaced by a new one. Perhaps they were unable to withstand the competition or fell victim to changing conditions. Their demise is one of the greatest mysteries of paleontology. But their brief existence was of colossal significance. They became the living embodiment of the moment when multicellularity ceased to be mere theory and became a visible reality. The rules of evolution shifted once again. Form began to serve function, and true, genuine complexity began to transform the face of the entire planet. The Ediacarans weren't the end point of evolution. Such points don't exist in nature. But for a brief, fleeting period in geological terms, they were the most daring and complex experiment on Earth. And in their shadow, something entirely different was already emerging, something destined to revolutionize the world. The end of the Proterozoic era was not marked by a fiery apocalypse. There was no giant comet piercing the skies, no mass extinction, leaving a black layer of ash in the geological record. The end of this era was far more gradual and quiet. It was a slow transformation, a gradual transition from one state to another, and after nearly 2 billion years of relative calm, such an ending seemed entirely natural. Calm, measured, and full of future changes. By the end of the Ediacaran period, Earth was unrecognizable. The atmosphere, once filled with methane and virtually devoid of oxygen, now contained enough oxygen to support larger, more energetic creatures. The oceans, whose depths had been anoxic and full of dissolved iron, changed their chemical composition. Surface waters became oxygenated, allowing new, more active forms of marine life to emerge. The continents, too, were not standing still. The ancient crust grew and stabilized through endless cycles of tectonic collisions. The giant supercontinent Rodinia was born and broken apart, and its drifting debris changed ocean currents and the global climate. The biosphere, too, was transformed beyond recognition. Life had once been the exclusive preserve of microbes, but now it flourished in thousands of new forms. The first true animals appeared. They were soft-bodied, difficult to classify, but crucially, they were mobile. The tracks left in the mud speak of a true revolution. These creatures had a front and a back, a head and a tail. For the first time in the planet's history, creatures capable of purposeful movement emerged. They began actively reshaping the seafloor, digging it up in search of food. The appearance of these fossilized tracks signals the emergence of new behaviors: foraging, hunting, and fleeing from danger. It was a sign of a fundamental shift. For most of Earth's history, life merely passively responded to its environment. Now, however, it began to actively shape it. Of course, the emergence of majestic forests or coral reefs was still a long way off, but the foundations for them were already being laid. A single worm, burrowing its way through the bottom mud, may seem like a small thing, but it is the engineer of an entire ecosystem. It changes how sediment settles, how oxygen penetrates the soil, how nutrients circulate. And these tiny changes, multiplied by millions, reshape the entire world, forcing it to adapt. All the tools for the future evolutionary arms race were already in place. Sexual reproduction opened the door to endless genetic diversity. Multicellularity transformed from an anomaly into the norm. Communication between cells was honed to perfection. The world grew more complex with each passing day. Bodies were no longer mere shells, but objects that could be inherited, modified, and improved. The rules of the game had changed forever. And yet, despite these monumental transformations, the end of the Proterozoic was not an abrupt end. There was no clear moment when the curtain fell and a new era began. The transition into the next, Phanerozoic epoch was gradual, blurred in time and space. It is we humans who draw clear boundaries between geological periods for our own convenience. But for nature, such boundaries do not exist. Nevertheless, the changes were clear. Fossils found immediately after this conventional milestone demonstrate an explosion of diversity. We see animals with bilateral symmetry, creatures with segmented bodies and hard shells. Animals that moved purposefully, hunted and devoured each other. The ecological web became increasingly complex and dynamic. Competition intensified, and in response to this challenge, life accelerated, giving rise to ever more advanced forms. The Cambrian explosion, as it would later be called, didn't arise out of nowhere. It was built on a solid foundation laid in the Proterozoic. Every detail that made the emergence of complex animals possible, atmospheric oxygen, new energy sources, cellular cooperation, sexual reproduction, was all developed, tested, and perfected in the quiet, ancient seas of the Proterozoic. Without this long preparation, there would be no vertebrates, no plants, no us. As an era drew to a close, the stage wasn't empty. On the contrary, it was ripe for new actors to emerge. Organisms that had maintained low diversity for billions of years were now poised for explosive growth. Small changes in genetic code could lead to colossal changes in appearance and function. The ecological brakes that had held evolution back were finally released. Oxygen levels reached levels sufficient to support the high-energy lifestyles of predators and their prey. Shells provided protection and support. Body segmentation allowed for more efficient movement. And one of nature's greatest inventions, eyes, was already looming on the horizon. True, image-forming eyes, which would forever change the rules of the game. But even at this point, the world was not yet fully formed. The seafloor was still covered with carpets of microbes. In some secluded corners of the ocean, the last representatives of the Ediacaran fauna were still living out their final days. Oxygen levels, though rising, were still unstable. Evolution continued its leisurely pace, generation after generation. This silence was deceptive. Under its cover, in the invisible laboratories of biology, the mechanisms of evolution were gaining unprecedented momentum. No one saw it happen. There were no observers or chroniclers back then. Only fossil traces, chemical imprints in rocks, and fragments of information imprinted in ancient stones tell us this astonishing story. In them, we see something vaguely familiar gradually taking shape. The Proterozoic era ended not because its time was up, but because its mission was fulfilled. It had created a solid foundation. It had stabilized the atmosphere. It had given birth to diversity. The cell had invented sex, complexity, and cooperation. More was needed. Life was ready to take the next step. The curtain hadn't fallen, it had only just begun to rise. We're used to thinking of evolution as a straight line leading from simple to complex, from bacteria to humans. But the reality is far more chaotic and interesting. Evolution had no purpose or direction. There was no plan to create intelligence, cities, or language. There was only persistence, experimentation, and inheritance. And at the heart of it all were microbes. Everything we are today begins with them. And this isn't an abstraction, not some distant stage in a history book. The connection is direct and biochemical. The cells that make up our bodies still retain the architecture of their Proterozoic ancestors. The tiny power plants within our cells, the mitochondria, inherited from countless generations, are the direct descendants of once free living bacteria. Our DNA is copied using mechanisms honed billions of years ago. Our metabolism operates along pathways laid by cells that lived in the oceans when the Earth was young. You don't have to dig deep to understand how deeply we are connected to this microbial past. Every animal, every plant, every fungus, everything with a nucleus is part of one gigantic experiment. An experiment that began the day one cell devoured another and, for some reason, chose not to digest it. All multicellular splendor arose from a choice that was repeated again and again. Cooperation, not division. All the complexity of the modern world, every living thing, every ecosystem, all of it stands on the invisible foundation they laid. The entire incredible infrastructure of life we see around us was designed and built by them. We think of the Proterozoic era as something unimaginably distant, a chapter lost in the depths of time. But this is a deceptive impression. In fact, that era hasn't gone anywhere. It lives on right now, within each of us. The complex mechanisms that make our trillions of cells work as a single whole. The elegant membranes that separate the cell's inner world from the chaos outside. The very process of respiration, the conversion of once toxic oxygen into life energy, growth and reproduction, all these are inventions of those very first organisms that inhabited the warm, shallow oceans before the continents we know today appeared on the planet. Their imprint, their genius, can be found everywhere. One need only look closely at the most ordinary things to see the shadow of their great past. Consider this. Long before the first animal grew fangs or spines, before living creatures had eyes to see and ears to hear, life itself already carried their unique code, their fundamental principles. Even with our complex brains, we remain guardians of these ancient secrets to this day. The genetic code itself, with its astonishing redundancy and error-correcting shortcuts. The internal cellular compartments they engineered for efficiency. The tools for flawlessly copying, cutting, and pasting vast amounts of information. All of this wasn't just part of their lives, it was their lives. Even what we consider errors or flaws today have their origins there. Random errors in the copying of genetic code, so-called slippage mutations. Misfolded proteins that lead to malfunctions. And even the aging process itself, which begins with tiny molecular breaks. All of this was inherited by us through billions of years of evolution, and paradoxically, it was precisely these imperfections that helped them become incredibly resilient and flexible. These pioneers of the microscopic world learned to survive in conditions that would seem utter hell to us. They withstood the unimaginable heat of volcanic vents, adapted to toxic chemicals, survived periods of famine, and even great ice ages when the entire planet turned into a giant ice ball. They completely redesigned their metabolism and rewrote their genomes, managing to survive every mass extinction that has ever occurred on our planet. Some of these ancient life forms have remained virtually unchanged for billions of years. Others, however, have become an integral part of us. We do not stand alone. We are merely one branch of their gigantic corporation of life, and, it must be said, far from the largest. If we were to weigh all the living matter on the planet today, all the biomass, microbes would still hold the undisputed lead. Their diversity simply defies imagination. They inhabit the human gut, live on the skin of each of us. They are in the soil beneath our feet and even in the clouds high above. These tiny architects help us digest food. They produce vital vitamins, and they train our immune system. Humans didn't just evolve from microbes, they still outnumber us to this day. When we peer into the misty distance of the past, into the Proterozoic era, it's like trying to remember something fundamental, long since forgotten. It wasn't a time before life, but a time when life was entirely different. It flowed much more slowly, it was quiet and almost imperceptible, but no less significant and intense. It simply played by different rules. The silence of that era is deceptive. It was not the silence of a void. On the contrary, it was the hum of a gigantic laboratory where nature conducted its boldest experiments. It was an era filled with brilliant ideas, evolutionary breakthroughs, and the development of survival strategies that would echo far into the future. Some of these experiments failed and sank into oblivion, but many others laid the foundation for all future diversity of life. The most effective of them, methods of energy production, methods of interaction, modes of reproduction and communication, were carefully preserved, honed to perfection, and passed on to future generations. And you and I are no exception to this great rule. We are the direct result of this endless process. We are neither its crown nor its end. We are its continuation. And those same fundamental laws that governed the world long before the first animals appeared still rule us. We breathe because, billions of years ago, they transformed oxygen from a deadly poison into the fuel of life. We digest food thanks to a symbiosis with ancient bacteria. We pass on our genes because, eons ago, some microorganisms invented an ingenious way to shuffle chromosomes. We don't live after prehistory. We live because of it. The next time you look at your hands, take a deep breath and ponder your existence. Remember, none of this came out of nowhere. It was created by a life that had nothing in common with us and never resembled us. Those silent cells, drifting serenely in primordial oceans, became the foundation of our entire being. They layered themselves upon each other, forming living carpets that merged, separated, and continually evolved. And yet, they are still here, in our flesh, in our blood, in our every cell. We are not simply inhabitants of planet Earth, we are messengers from deep time. Microbes came to this planet first. They built this world from scratch and, ultimately, took us along on this incredible journey. This era is called the Proterozoic era. It may not be the most spectacular blockbuster or the most gripping chapter in a school textbook, but it encompassed almost half of Earth's history, nearly 2 billion years. And during this seemingly calm and leisurely period, almost everything that matters happened. Cells learned to work as a team, forming complex alliances. Oxygen became a life-giving force. Continents collided and drifted apart like giant ice floes. The ocean was twice covered in ice from pole to pole. And despite all these cataclysms, microbes continued their titanic labor. They worked, adapted, and survived. Slowly, with incredible patience, they built the complex systems that would one day enable us to exist. The Proterozoic was not an era of brilliant outbursts. There was simply no need for them. Everything proceeded as usual, methodically, experimentally, step by step, without ceasing. The main question then was not what life looks like now, but what it might become in the future. Without this long, quiet foundation, we would not exist. There would be no ability to think, no breathing, no bodies, no language. Every tiny detail of what we call life today is a direct legacy of those infinitely distant times, born in silence from the tiniest building blocks. We didn't witness the beginning of this story. We appeared after its foundations were laid, and the plan worked. Its traces, hidden in the depths of the stone, preserved in the chemical composition of rocks, and encoded in our cells, continue to unfold before us to this day. And to touch this legacy, you don't need to invent a time machine and travel back to the Proterozoic. Such a journey is unnecessary. Each of us carries this ancient era within us. Imagine ancient oceans that existed long before any life we know emerged, at a time when the deep sea contained virtually no oxygen necessary for oxidation reactions. The waters of our planet were supersaturated with iron. This dissolved iron drifted freely through the water masses until something upset the delicate balance and forced it to the bottom. This catalyst was typically the activity of the first microscopic organisms. Microbes, which produced oxygen through photosynthesis, essentially emitted it as a byproduct. This waste triggered a massive chemical reaction. The iron reacted with oxygen, literally rusted, and settled in colossal quantities to the ocean floor. Thus, layer by layer, over hundreds of millions of years, unique geological structures, banded iron formations, were formed. They grew in a slow, rhythmic dance, where periods of iron-enriched waters alternated with periods of massive iron precipitation. Each such band in the rock is a separate chapter in the history of the chemical composition of the ancient world, a chronicle of the rise and fall of microbial activity on a planet undergoing a global chemical revolution. For us today, this is one of the most important pieces of evidence revealing what the oceans of the Proterozoic era were like. And the key to their formation lay in two conditions: a catastrophic lack of oxygen and an incredible abundance of iron. Life was already thriving in these ancient seas, but an outside observer would hardly have noticed. There was nothing familiar, no fish darting through the water, no waving seaweed, no coral reefs. Crabs, jellyfish, even plankton as we know it, all of these would appear much later. At that time, life consisted almost exclusively of microorganisms, which formed thin layers, films, and entire carpets on the seafloor. If we could transport ourselves there with modern technology and take a closer look, we might see stromatolites. These are bizarre layered formations created by entire colonies of cyanobacteria and other microbes. They grew incredibly slowly, year after year, layer after layer, capturing sediment particles and gradually turning into fossilized domes. Some arose in shallow waters, in tidal zones, while others formed in the eternal darkness of great depths. Many were buried under new sediments and preserved to this day as fossils, although a few living colonies can still be found today in the most isolated corners of the Earth. These microbial mats weren't just clusters of cells. We were witnessing complex, multi-layered ecosystems. Different species of bacteria occupied their own layers within this living structure, depending on the amount of light and chemicals available to them. The upper layers, bathed in the dim light of the ancient sun, photosynthesized. Those living below, in the darkness, fed on the waste from the upper layers and recycled nutrients. It was a vertically organized, self-sufficient world contained within just a few centimeters of bottom mud. Deep in the ocean, where no ray of light penetrated, a completely different kind of life reigned. There, near scorching hydrothermal vents, archaea and bacteria thrived, perfectly adapted to existence in an environment with minimal energy. Their metabolism was incredibly slow. Their lives were measured not in hours, but rather in days or even weeks. But these creatures were remarkably resilient and played a vital role in regulating the chemical balance of the entire world's oceans. Since large animals capable of digging through bottom sediments didn't yet exist, the seafloor was a dark and stagnant realm where chemical gradients could persist for very long periods. And the main player in this underwater theater was methane. Specialized microbes known as methanogens produced it as a byproduct of their life processes, saturating both the water and the atmosphere. Methane is an extremely potent greenhouse gas. Its abundance likely served as a warm blanket for the planet, preventing it from freezing, as the ancient sun's light was significantly weaker at the time. For most of the Proterozoic, Earth's atmosphere likely consisted of a dense cocktail of nitrogen, carbon dioxide, water vapor, and methane. It contained only traces of oxygen. The interactions between these gases and ocean chemistry were incredibly complex. Any changes in microbial activity could have dramatically altered the atmosphere's composition. And then, as photosynthesis gained momentum and began supplying ever more oxygen, this delicate balance began to crumble. The process wasn't instantaneous, it stretched out over an eternity. For millions of years, oxygen, as soon as it appeared, reacted with dissolved iron, methane, and sulfur compounds. It disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, but the microbes continued their tireless work, unaware of the consequences. They simply did what they knew how to do: split water, absorbed light, and released oxygen. As a result, the planet's oceans began to literally rust. This process was uneven. The most noticeable changes occurred in shallow waters, near microbial colonies. Meanwhile, the deep ocean layers remained anoxic for many hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of years. Scientists call this a stratified ocean, a layered pie where oxygen is present at the surface, but absent altogether just below. Over time, the oxygen layer grew thicker, penetrating deeper and deeper. This completely changed ocean chemistry. A new, important player entered the picture: sulfur. Hydrogen sulfide, a gas with a rotten egg smell, was released by certain microbes in oxygen-deficient conditions. As it accumulated in mid-depth waters, vast zones formed that were simultaneously anoxic and saturated with toxic sulfides. These conditions are lethal to the vast majority of modern organisms, but for the microbes of that era, they were an ideal habitat. Some researchers call these zones euxinic, and while these waters would be a toxic hell for us, they were stable and could persist in this state for hundreds of millions of years. This serves as a stark reminder that the very concept of habitability is variable. What would kill us in seconds today was then the norm. And conditions we now consider extreme were routine for many ancient creatures. Early in our planet's history, the oceans were quiet, chemically complex, and biologically active at the microscopic level. They supported life, but this life played by entirely different rules. In these silent depths, slow, invisible processes unfolded, a true revolution in metabolism and energy use. It was here, in these vast waters, that one of the greatest turning points in Earth's history would take place: the birth of an oxygen-rich world. This process wasn't like the flip of a switch, with the oceans or skies suddenly changing color overnight. The Great Rusting of the Seas, as it's sometimes called, was a long and painful transformation that forever altered the face of the planet. When oxygen first appeared in significant quantities, it wasn't a boon, but rather a dangerous pollutant. The microbes that first produced it, particularly cyanobacteria, weren't doing so for the future of humanity. They were simply struggling to survive and found a more efficient way to generate energy by capturing sunlight and splitting water molecules. From a biological perspective, this was a stroke of genius, but from a chemical perspective, it had disastrous consequences. Free oxygen is an extremely reactive substance. It can't exist alone and is eager to react with anything. It especially loves metals, such as iron. Iron was abundant in ancient oceans. Dissolved in water, it gave it a greenish or brownish tint. Since there was almost no oxygen to bind it, the iron remained in solution. But with the arrival of the first oxygen, the rules of the game changed dramatically. Every microorganism pursued the same goal: to survive and obtain energy. This led to an increasing amount of oxygen in the ocean, which immediately began to interact with the dissolved iron. The oxygen molecule, colliding with the iron ion, triggered an oxidation reaction. Simply put, the iron rusted. But not in the way we're used to seeing in old cars, but in the form of microscopic suspended particles. The oxidized iron became insoluble and began to precipitate out of the water. Slowly, like brown snow, these particles sank to the seafloor, forming layer after layer of iron-rich sediment. Over time, these layers fossilized, turning into rock. Today, we can see their legacy: banded iron ores, rocky slabs in which dark, heavy layers of iron alternate with lighter layers of silica. They are found on almost every continent: Australia, Canada, South Africa, and Brazil. They vary in thickness, color, and composition, but all are irrefutable witnesses to the long and inexorable chemical shift in our planet's oceans. This process wasn't smooth. It occurred in waves. Periods of sharply increased oxygen production were followed by lulls. Sometimes, oxygen spread far enough to acidify vast swaths of the ocean. At other times, it remained trapped near the microbial mats that had generated it. It's as if the Earth was learning to breathe, taking its first ragged and uneven breaths. This phase of global rusting likely lasted hundreds of millions of years. And it wasn't just a beautiful geological phenomenon, but only the beginning of tectonic shifts in the biosphere. As more and more iron was removed from the ocean, its chemical composition became depleted, leading to further changes. Oxygen, no longer with which to react in the water, began to accumulate at the surface and leak into the atmosphere. There, it reacted with methane, previously the main greenhouse gas, and destroyed it. This led to global cooling, which played a fatal role in the future. But even before that, the advent of free oxygen created entirely new conditions for life. For the many anaerobic organisms that thrived in an oxygen-free world, it was a deadly poison. It destroyed their enzymes and disrupted their metabolism. For a time, much of the biosphere was poisoned by the very gas we now depend on. Entire branches of evolution were likely wiped off the face of the Earth, unable to adapt to the new hostile conditions. However, life, as always, found a way. Even in this new, toxic world, there were those who were able to adapt. Some of these tiny creatures developed a kind of biochemical armor, special enzymes that neutralized the deadly oxygen, converting the poison into a harmless substance. Others chose a path of retreat. They burrowed deeper into the bottom mud, into dark, oxygen-free refuges, fleeing this new threat rushing from the surface. Evolution did not freeze in horror, it simply changed course, adapting to previously unimaginable conditions. Ancient rocks preserve a silent record of this global transformation. Imagine a geological cross-section where the layers suddenly change character. It is in these places that we, modern researchers, see evidence of a great drama. The planet's oceans have exhausted their reserves of free iron. The great rusting has come to an end. Oxygen has accomplished its titanic work, cleansing the world's waters of suspended metal, and a new world has begun to emerge from the ruins of the old. Now, it seemed, nothing could stop the atmosphere from truly becoming saturated with this gas. This event, which scientists call the Great Oxidation Event, didn't resemble a sudden explosion. Rather, it resembled a drawn-out game of complex strategy, with long periods of calm and unpredictable plot twists. Nevertheless, this was a turning point in the planet's history. In a geologically short time, Earth's entire chemistry was rewritten from scratch. The oceans were transformed from a murky, iron-rich and toxic sludge into something entirely different, a cradle capable of nurturing incredibly complex life forms in the future. Along with their composition, the color of the seas also changed. Without the dissolved iron that gave the water its brown, rusty hue, it likely became clear and pure in many places. As oxygen concentrations began to rise, albeit slightly, entire microbial communities began to proliferate and thrive. Sunlight could now penetrate much deeper into the water column, creating entirely new ecological niches, new layers in this underwater world. If we were to look at Earth from space at that moment, it would seem familiar. The blue of the oceans, the grey patches of the continents, the white swirls of clouds. But this was only a superficial calm. Beneath this familiar surface, a true revolution was unfolding. This sea reorganization was more than just a geological process. It was part of a global shift that could no longer be reversed. Oxygen had established a foothold, and its expansion was now unstoppable. And the next steps in this story promised to be challenging. A sharp spike in atmospheric oxygen levels triggered a global cooling. Oxygen reacted with methane, a powerful greenhouse gas that had previously warmed the planet. Methane levels dropped catastrophically, thinning Earth's thermal blanket, and the planet found itself on the brink of its first ice age. But for the microscopic workers in the shallows, everything was going according to plan. They continued to remake the world in their own image, completely oblivious to whether anyone noticed. And somewhere out there, in a quiet, inconspicuous backwater, bubbles of oxygen continued to rise to the surface, the breath of a new world. It's so easy to overlook the colossal role played in Earth's history by these tiny creatures. cyanobacteria. These microscopic organisms, resembling loops and chains of cells, float in water or cling to rocks in places we wouldn't even think to look. But they are among the main architects of our planet. Their modest size has been more than compensated for by their truly titanic influence on the entire world. Let's fast forward to the Proterozoic era, when life was represented solely by microbes. Back then, cyanobacteria were among the most prominent players on the scene. They didn't roar menacingly, the ground didn't tremble beneath their feet, and they didn't cleave the skies. They didn't have bones capable of supporting their multi-ton bodies, and yet, armed only with the energy of sunlight and their incredible tenacity, they forever changed Earth's chemistry. It's worth clarifying. Cyanobacteria weren't the first living things on the planet. By the time they triumphed, life had already existed for over 1 billion years. But they had one fundamental difference from all their predecessors. They invented oxygenic photosynthesis, a brilliant biochemical trick that allowed them to take carbon dioxide and water, capture the energy of the sun's rays, and create sugar for food. In this process, they split water molecules, releasing oxygen as a byproduct, like exhaust fumes. No one asked them to do this. They didn't hold secret meetings or plot to remake the world. It just happened that way. It wasn't a conscious decision, but the result of countless mutations, trial and error, a fortunate confluence of chemical circumstances. But once this mechanism was in place, it began to spread rapidly. Oxygenous photosynthesis proved to be many times more efficient than its more ancient counterparts, which were used by other bacteria that relied on sulfur compounds or hydrogen. This incredible efficiency gave cyanobacteria an undeniable evolutionary advantage. They could grow faster, conquer new territories, and simply outcompete their competitors. Gradually, their populations expanded to incredible proportions. Cyanobacteria covered tidal flats and underwater rocks with solid living carpets lining shallow lagoons. Some learned to swim freely in the upper layers of the ocean, greedily absorbing sunlight wherever it could reach. Their colonies weren't simply clusters of identical cells, they formed complex, multi-layered systems. Beneath the top layer of cyanobacteria lived other microbial species, which fed on the waste of their neighbors or utilized the wavelengths of light that penetrated the upper layer. Together, these microbial communities created surprisingly stable and resilient ecosystems. They built entire cascades of light, oxygen, and nutrients, recycling the elements and constructing complex structures. Over time, these ecosystems began to create something truly astonishing: stromatolites. These are dome-shaped, layered rock formations that we still find today in ancient rocks. Stromatolites are more than just a geological curiosity. They are fossilized evidence of microbial life, frozen for millennia. These structures grew layer upon layer, microbial mats, trapped sediment particles, secreted minerals, and cemented it all together with their mucus. The result was a veritable tower of biology and geology, a slowly growing monument to the resilience of ancient life. In the early Proterozoic, stromatolites were everywhere. They covered vast areas of shallow seas and stretched along coastlines, forming something like the planet's first reefs. These ecosystems were among the most dominant on Earth, and although many of these rock structures were created by cyanobacteria, their true legacy lay not in the rock, but in the air. The oxygen these microbes continually released into the environment initially had no global impact. It was greedily consumed by iron in the oceans, volcanic gases, and decaying organic matter. For millions of years, the atmosphere remained virtually unchanged. But as the Great Rusting Event progressed, all these natural oxygen reservoirs began to overflow. Iron levels in the seas dropped, and reactive gases were neutralized. And eventually, a point came when the oxygen had nowhere to go but upward, into the atmosphere. The cyanobacteria, which played a key role in this, continued their activities without a thought for the consequences. They had no intention of changing the world. They simply lived, following their genetic blueprint. but they became the catalyst for the greatest changes. The oxygen they released, accumulating in the atmosphere, disrupted the delicate gas balance and triggered a chain of transformations. One of the first consequences was a blow to the climate. Methane, the main greenhouse gas of the era, proved extremely sensitive to oxygen. As oxygen concentrations rose, methane levels fell, weakening the greenhouse effect and plunging the planet into global cold. It is highly likely that the earliest and most extensive ice ages in Earth's history were at least partly caused by the emergence of cyanobacteria and the changes they triggered in the atmosphere. But their impact on life itself was even more dramatic. For many organisms that thrived in an oxygen-free environment, oxygen proved a deadly poison. It disrupted their cellular machinery, blocked energy production, and damaged their DNA. Entire ecosystems were wiped off the face of the Earth. Microbial communities of the Old World were forced to retreat to the deep layers of the soil, to isolated corners of the planet where oxygen had not yet reached. However, other organisms managed to adapt. The oxygen crisis, as it is sometimes called, became a powerful impetus for evolution. Some microbes developed antioxidant defenses, others went even further. They learned to utilize oxygen itself, mastering aerobic respiration, a much more efficient way of extracting energy from food. This discovery opened the door to greater complexity, faster metabolism, and entirely new cellular structures. Cyanobacteria weren't the end goal of evolution. They were merely a catalyst. They created the conditions that allowed the emergence of complex cells and, ultimately, multicellular life. Their humble activities transformed the biosphere, the atmosphere, and the chemistry of the oceans. They had no idea they were opening a new chapter in the history of life. But that's exactly what they did. Direct descendants of these ancient revolutionaries still live among us. They can be found in any pond, on damp rocks, in hot springs, and even in deserts. They appear as green slime in stagnant water or a slippery coating on river boulders. These organisms may not be beautiful, but they are incredibly ancient, remarkably resilient, and continue to follow the same biochemical pathway that revolutionized the world billions of years ago. Every breath we take contains oxygen, made possible by them, and not just because they produce it now, but because they began their great transformation back in the Proterozoic, coating the young Earth with thin blue-green films. It was one of the most fateful events in the history of our planet. For such a fundamental aspect of modern life as oxygen, it was a completely unexpected debut. No one expected it, and for most of the earliest organisms on Earth, its appearance was a true catastrophe, an unpleasant discovery that we today call the Great Oxidation Event. For the microbial world, the Great Oxidation Event, or GOE for short, was a true catastrophe. In many ways, it was the beginning of a slow but absolutely inexorable process that threatened the complete destruction of the then dominant life forms. And it all began, seemingly completely innocuous. Cyanobacteria, as it turned out, released a byproduct of photosynthesis, oxygen, into the surrounding world. Initially, this gas was in minuscule quantities. It was greedily absorbed by iron dissolved in the oceans, neutralized by gases from volcanic activity, and used to oxidize decaying organic matter. Imagine a dry sponge splashed with water. The planetary system absorbed this new gas instantly, preventing it from accumulating. For millions of years, oxygen barely entered the atmosphere in any significant quantities. It simply dissolved in the gigantic chemical reactor of ancient Earth. But even the largest sponge has its limits. Eventually, all the containers began to overflow. The ocean's iron reserves dried up, forever buried in the reddish-banded formations that geologists still find today. Volcanic gases either dissipated or were absorbed. The chemical composition of the world's oceans themselves gradually changed, and then, one day, although no one kept calendars in those ancient times, oxygen had nowhere to go. It stopped disappearing and began accumulating in the atmosphere. It didn't look like an explosion. The process of atmospheric oxygenation likely spanned decades, if not millions, of years. However, in geological time, it was an incredibly rapid and dramatic shift. For many anaerobic organisms that evolved in a world where free oxygen simply didn't exist, it was the end of the world. The fact is that oxygen is an extremely reactive molecule, capable of breaking down proteins, fats, and even DNA. In small doses, it causes oxidative stress, and in large doses, it is simply toxic. For microbes perfectly adapted to an oxygen-free environment, the rising concentration of this gas was tantamount to their world being slowly flooded with corrosive acid. Entire microbial ecosystems collapsed before our eyes or were driven to the most inhospitable corners of the planet. Anaerobic bacteria, which had previously reigned ubiquitously, were forced to seek refuge in deep seabed sediments, near hydrothermal vents, anywhere where the concentration of this toxic gas was minimal. Some of them were unlucky and disappeared forever. The entire planet's biosphere underwent colossal, irreversible changes. Those who managed to adapt survived. The rest vanished into oblivion, leaving behind only barely noticeable chemical traces in ancient rocks. And, on a planetary scale, the most dramatic consequences of these changes were only just beginning. Methane, a key greenhouse gas that had warmed the Earth like a blanket under the rays of the dim young sun, began to rapidly break down in the presence of oxygen. The atmosphere began to cool. Reflective ice began to form at the poles, which, quite possibly, began to creep toward the equator like an ominous ice cap. Earth likely experienced one of the first global glaciations in its history, or at least a severe climate crisis. This remarkable interplay between biology and climate, between the metabolism of tiny microorganisms and global temperatures, marked the beginning of an entirely new stage in the history of our planet, a stage in which Earth began to regulate itself in complex, dynamic, interconnected, and at times incredibly violent ways. Oxygen also had a profound effect on the chemistry of the atmosphere itself. Ozone, a special molecule composed of 3 oxygen atoms, began to form in the upper layers. Although ozone is unstable at the surface, at high altitudes it became a true life-saving shield, absorbing the sun's harmful ultraviolet radiation. Until then, life could only exist in the deep ocean or deep within rock, as the ultraviolet radiation at the surface was so intense that it literally scorched all life. However, as the ozone layer gradually accumulated, surface conditions began to moderate, becoming less hostile to future stages of evolution. This process created a remarkable feedback loop. The more oxygen, the more ozone was formed. The more ozone, the weaker the ultraviolet radiation, and the safer the shallow waters became, the more active life became, producing even more oxygen. Thus, the Great Oxidation Event, despite all the horror and destruction in its early stages, laid the fundamental foundation for all future life on Earth. However, this initial oxygen surge was apparently followed by a long period of instability. Atmospheric oxygen levels would rise sharply, only to fall again. The system would falter when new biological innovations or geological cataclysms led to a precipitous decline in oxygen concentrations. The atmosphere of the early Proterozoic era resembled not a stable mixture of gases, but a vast, constantly shifting patchwork. For organisms attempting to survive in these conditions, the ability to adapt became the key to survival. The very term, oxygen depletion, sounds almost like a medical diagnosis, but for many ancient inhabitants of Earth, it was more like a slow poisoning, followed by an excruciatingly long recovery period. Even for those who managed to survive, this meant radical changes. Entirely new metabolic strategies had to emerge, and some microbes began to exploit the enemy for their own ends. Oxygen became an integral part of their energy cycle, leading to the development of aerobic respiration. This process proved orders of magnitude more efficient than the previous anaerobic pathways. It allowed cells to extract much more energy from the same amount of food. This incredible efficiency opened up entirely new evolutionary horizons. The emergence of larger cells became possible. More energy meant more complex internal structures, as well as more sophisticated self-repair mechanisms. Eventually, Some microbes developed internal organelles, including mitochondria, that specialized specifically in processing oxygen. But this would happen later. Meanwhile, oxygen was still gaining ground. It accumulated in the atmosphere, slowly rising. It permeated soil and minerals, triggering new types of chemical weathering that forever changed the face of the continents. The famous red layers, oxidized sedimentary rocks found throughout the world, are part of this legacy. This iron in ancient soil reacted with atmospheric oxygen, coloring entire rock strata the familiar rusty hue. It's strange today to think of oxygen as an environmental toxin, but in the early Proterozoic, that's exactly what it was. It caused extinctions, reshaped ecosystems and climates, and left an indelible geological scar on the planet. And yet, it made the emergence of the modern biosphere possible. However, none of this was obvious at the time. The planet had taken a dramatic, unpredictable turn. Life was still microscopic, but its waste products transformed the atmosphere, the oceans, and the entire world. They set the course of evolution for billions of years to come, and all of this happened without the slightest plan or design. Tiny cells simply floated in shallow water, soaking up sunlight and doing what they did best, inhaling carbon dioxide, exhaling oxygen, and leaving the rest of the world to deal with the consequences. The sky above early Proterozoic Earth was boundless. But it was nothing like our own, at least not always. Depending on when you found yourself on that damp, rocky surface and the amount of certain gases in the atmosphere, you might have seen a sky tinged with hues more reminiscent of science fiction than reality. It wasn't the pale blue horizon we're familiar with, but something darker, heavier, and more fluid. The skies were undergoing a great transformation, and like everything else in the Proterozoic, it seemed to unfold in slow motion. Before the advent of oxygen, Earth's atmosphere was rich in gases such as methane, carbon dioxide, water vapor, nitrogen, and hydrogen. Volcanoes emitted sulfur compounds into the air, and ultraviolet radiation from the sun penetrated the surface virtually unfiltered. Without an ozone layer, there was nothing to block it, and without abundant oxygen, there was no mechanism for ozone formation. Methane played a key role in shaping that world. This gas, known as a potent greenhouse gas, also has an interesting effect on light. When present in high concentrations, methane can form a dense haze of organic particles in the atmosphere, known as tholins. These are likely the conditions that existed on early Earth. The sky was perpetually obscured by this haze, which diffused the light and tinted the air orange or even brown. Depending on the fog's density and the viewing angle, it could have resembled something between a perpetual crimson sunrise and a dark, stormy twilight. And then oxygen appeared. As free oxygen began to accumulate, it immediately reacted with methane. The breakdown of methane led to a sharp decrease in its concentration in the atmosphere, and with it, the orange haze began to dissipate. The sky cleared, and the very physics of sunlight scattering changed. For the first time, the atmosphere began to acquire its unique, familiar character. The atmosphere's behavior changed, and shorter, bluer wavelengths of light began to predominate in the sky, making it much more familiar to our eyes. It's difficult to pinpoint exactly when the sky turned blue, at least as we know it. The transition from brown to blue wasn't instantaneous. It occurred gradually, step by step. As the old haze cleared and a new clarity emerged, sunlight gradually filtered through the changing mixture of gases, and we would begin to notice that blue color we associate with an oxygen-rich atmosphere. Over time, oxygen levels rose, methane levels fell, and the protective ozone layer began to form in the upper atmosphere. Ozone forms when ultraviolet radiation breaks oxygen molecules, O2, into individual atoms. And so, high in the atmosphere, the oxygen molecules begin their dance. Some disintegrate under the harsh solar radiation, and the freed atoms immediately find new partners, fusing with other O2 molecules. Thus, ozone is born. This process, once started, never stops. Slowly but surely, it wove an invisible blanket over the planet, a vital protective layer that had never existed before. This ozone shield began to absorb the lion's share of the deadly ultraviolet radiation that had previously scorched the surface unchecked. For the first time in Earth's history, shallow lagoons and bare rocks ceased to be death traps. They certainly didn't transform into Garden of Eden, but now life could at least contemplate venturing out from the ocean depths. This invisible dome in the sky also brought stability to the atmosphere. In terms of radiation, the planet became a much calmer place. With fewer ultraviolet rays penetrating the surface, fragile organic molecules had a chance to survive longer without instantly disintegrating. Mutations certainly remained, and the great engine of evolution didn't slow down, but the environment itself was no longer so hostile and destructive. This global change, in turn, opened new horizons for microscopic life, new ecological spaces to explore. If there had been eyes capable of seeing on the planet at that moment, they would have noticed astonishing changes. The transparency of the atmosphere transformed the play of light on the surface. Shadows acquired depth and sharpness, and colors shimmered with unprecedented vibrancy. For the first time, the evening sky began to take on the fiery hues we admire today. But there were no witnesses to this grand spectacle. Neither people nor animals had yet appeared to admire this dazzling show or stand in awe at the horizon. The planet was inhabited only by countless trillions of microbes, silently busy with their chemical affairs. And while the skies above them were changing, changes were brewing on the planet itself. Its temperature was shifting. As the atmosphere became increasingly depleted of methane and increasingly concentrated in carbon dioxide, the greenhouse effect underwent a dramatic shift. Methane is a much more powerful heat trapper than CO2, so its decline likely triggered global cooling. Over the long term, this trend paved the way for the planet's first great glaciations, ice ages that encased the Earth in a frozen shell. During those eras, severe frosts may have extended from the poles to the equator, but before the first snow fell, the light itself changed. Ancient rocks, witnesses of that era, cannot fully tell us about the sky. They say nothing about the exact shade of blue above the first continents, or how the sun's rays played across the surface of an ancient reef built by bacteria. But they do provide some clues. The red layers in the rocks are deposits rich in iron oxides. They formed when iron in the soil and sediments began to react with oxygen from the atmosphere. Their very existence is irrefutable proof that oxygen was already present in the air in enormous quantities. It was enough to forever alter the weathering processes of mountains and leave its bright, rusty mark on the geological record. The very idea that the sky's color is simply the result of chemical reactions may seem strange. We take it for granted. Looking up, we expect to see blue during the day, crimson at sunset, and star-studded blackness at night. But it wasn't always so. Our entire world can be imagined as the result of a complex interaction between the atmosphere, the mixture of gases, the angles of sunlight, and the reaction of molecules to light. In the Proterozoic era, the sky was still searching for itself. It hadn't yet decided what it would be, and only gradually did it acquire the appearance we consider familiar today. Meanwhile, below, in the world of microorganisms, life went on as usual, oblivious to the dramatic changes in the upper atmosphere. The oxygen revolution was far from complete. Its concentration continued to rise, and with it, so did the pressure of evolutionary selection, forcing life to adapt and, ultimately, give rise to an entirely new type of cell. These ancient communities had no blueprints. They planned nothing. They had no scaffolding, no tools, no architects as we know them. But even without all of these, they managed to leave an indelible mark on the face of the planet. Long before corals, reefs, termite mounds, or human cities arose, clusters of bacteria began constructing their own unique structures. These amazing, delicate organisms built living structures, layer by layer, cell by cell, and spread across the globe. They found refuge in shallow waters, on the seafloor, in tidal flats, at the edges of lagoons, and on coastal platforms, anywhere where there was enough sunlight and the water was calm enough. At first, these bacterial mats were thin, like sheets of photosynthetic film. The microbes clung to the surface, held together by mucus secretions, but over time, their communities became increasingly complex. Their structure developed verticality. Multi-level communities emerged, and with them, clear divisions in access to light, oxygen, nutrients, and waste disposal. This was true chemical zoning. Cyanobacteria dominated the upper layers. They did all the heavy lifting, capturing sunlight, breaking down water, producing oxygen, and synthesizing sugars. Directly below them lived other microbes, anaerobes, which used these sugars for their own needs. Consumers of cyanobacterial waste products, hydrogen sulfide scavengers, nitrogen fixers, fermenters. Each had its own unique niche in this multi-layered ecosystem. The deeper we delve into the structure of this mat, the less oxygen remains in the water. In low oxygen zones or in completely anoxic regions, the microorganism's metabolism changed dramatically. Instead of producing oxygen, these organisms decomposed. They processed, broke down, and converted organic material back into forms usable by the layers above. It was not a hierarchy, but rather a perfectly closed cycle of production and recycling. Some of these bacterial mats captured and held sediment, tiny grains of sand and silt particles carried by tides and currents. Others precipitated minerals directly from the water using the byproducts of their metabolism. Over time, these processes led to the accumulation of layers, forming layered structures. Initially flat, they later became dome-shaped or columnar, evolving into what we call stromatolites. Some grew as isolated mounds, while others stretched for kilometers, forming entire reef fields. Stromatolites are astonishing formations that once covered entire coastal shelves like a giant patchwork quilt woven from microorganisms. Today, they are found only in a few corners of the planet: Shark Bay in Australia, some hypersaline lagoons, and a few alkaline lakes. Modern stromatolites grow painfully slowly, often in extreme conditions, undisturbed by herbivores or competing algae. However, these are only faint echoes of the era when these living stones were ubiquitous. During the Proterozoic, stromatolites were one of the most dominant phenomena in the shallow waters of the world's oceans. This wasn't because they were huge or grew rapidly, but because they had virtually no competition. Nothing else created permanent, mineralized structures on such a scale. Nothing else shaped the environment in such a noticeable, multi-layered manner. These structures weren't just biological communities. They were veritable geobiological machines. Each layer of the microbial mat performed its own, strictly defined function, creating unique conditions for life. The entire structure completely controlled its own internal chemical composition. Oxygen was produced in one place and immediately consumed in another. Sulfide was produced in one layer and used in the next. Carbon was constantly cycling through photosynthesis, respiration, and fermentation. Despite their modest appearance, these formations were systems teeming with life inside. They influenced the stability of the seafloor by trapping sediment grains and shaping local microclimates. Their activity altered the chemical composition of the surrounding waters, regulating pH and redox conditions. These tiny cities were equipped with their own micro-districts, division of labor, waste management systems, energy generation, and even defense. Predators didn't yet exist, but competition was fierce. Different strains of bacteria waged a silent war for space, light, and access to nutrients. Some bacterial mats learned to produce antimicrobial compounds, protecting themselves from intruders. Others evolved to grow faster or adapted to life in deeper, darker waters. Evolution didn't wait for eyes or limbs to emerge before it gained momentum. The architecture of these structures wasn't made of stone or bone, but it was incredibly strong. Stromatolites are remarkably well preserved in the geological record, especially in carbonate-rich environments. Over time, their layers fossilized, turning into solid rock. Some of these stones contain microfossils, tiny filaments and spheres that give us insight into the cells that built these structures. Others preserve only the texture of the layers, but either way, these formations are an invaluable source of information. They not only tell us who lived where, but also provide clues to the chemical composition of ancient oceans, oxygen levels, and sunlight intensity. They help us understand which microbes thrived in these environments and how these environments facilitated the development of more complex life forms. The layers build up slowly, allowing us to peer into Earth's deep history. Geologists study them, measure them, and analyze their composition, revealing how the environment has changed over millions of years. There's something quiet and majestic about contemplating how long these bacterial mats have been part of the planet's ecosystem. For most Proterozoic creatures, microbial mats weren't just a temporary stopover or a niche. They were the dominant life form. They were at the center of everything for over 1 billion years. No other life form in Earth's history has come close to emulating their long and unbroken reign. Their survival tactics were deliberate. They were measured, coordinated, and built layer by layer like a living tapestry, and this approach worked flawlessly for an unimaginably long time. Of course, one day, everything was bound to change. In the future, new, more complex cells will emerge, the first herbivores will evolve, and the unshakable stability of microbial mats will be disrupted. But before that moment, there were entire eras. Here, in the middle of the Proterozoic era, they were the great architects of the biosphere. They sculpted coastlines, orchestrated the chemistry of the oceans and atmosphere, and erected their quiet, endless cities, building them up layer by layer. Let's step into this world. For most of our planet's history, life had no face. There were no eyes to see, no mouths to consume. There was not a single spine to defend against, not a single bone to support. The air remained pristine, unpierced by the whistle of wings. The ocean depths were silent, uncut by a single fin. There was no movement in the sense we understand the word. Nothing pursued its prey, and nothing attempted to flee. There was no vision as such, and responses to light did not extend beyond molecular and cellular membranes. And yet, life here teemed. The Proterozoic era was the realm of microbes. Absolutely everything was microscopic. Almost all life existed in the form of single cells. The diversity of forms was colossal, but it unfolded on a scale invisible to the non-existent eye. And it wasn't that more complex life was impossible, it was simply that there was no need for it yet. There was no arms race on the planet. There was no eternal standoff between predator and prey. Survival on this world was not a race. It required neither lightning speed, nor complex anatomy, nor a central command center controlling the body. Microbes were the rulers of this planet, but their weapon was not force, but chemistry. Their reign was built not on actions, but on the very fact of their existence, on their breath, and the products of their life processes. Imagine each cell as a tiny chemical factory, where the most ancient metabolic processes, the absorption, transformation, and release of energy and substances, continue uninterrupted. There were no faces to read intentions from, and no limbs to maneuver. And yet, within this apparent simplicity, there existed a language of its own. It was the language of chemistry. Invisible signals, like messages, were transmitted from one cell to another. Gradients, changes in the concentrations of substances, served as a map and compass, telling the microbes which way to go, when to begin growing, and at what point to divide. They did move, but only when absolutely necessary. Some possessed flexible, whip-like flagella that allowed them to steer towards sources of nutrition or escape toxic environments. Others simply surrendered to the currents, becoming silent passengers in the ocean's vast cradle. Some clung tenaciously to the surface, others sank to the bottom and waited. Life was not fast, but it was governed by the iron logic of efficiency. The fact that they had no eyes didn't mean they were blind. Light was everything to them. Many of these microscopic creatures, especially those who had mastered the art of photosynthesis, were acutely sensitive to it. Cyanobacteria, for example, skillfully shifted their position in the water column to capture precisely the wavelengths they needed. Some even performed daily migrations, rising and falling in response to changes in illumination or water clarity. Yes, they lacked vision, but they did have photoreceptors, molecular sensors that, upon receiving a dose of light, triggered a cascade of reactions, altering the cell's behavior. The entire microbial biosphere was strictly organized according to these invisible boundaries. Light above, darkness below. Oxygen in some zones, completely absent in others. Varying levels of temperature, acidity, and salinity. Each layer of water or bottom sediment had its own unique set of characteristics, and microbes specialized, occupying their own, strictly defined niche. Some could thrive only in a narrow layer where 2 or 3 vital conditions converged. Others were true extreme sportsmen, able to survive in boiling water, concentrated salt, acid, or under monstrous pressure. Their diversity was incredible, even if they appeared similar on the surface. And this was far from a static, frozen world. Genetic changes were a constant stream. Bacteria reproduce at astonishing rates, and every cell division is a chance for a new mutation to emerge. This mechanism allowed them to generate an astonishing diversity of forms over millions of years, and horizontal gene transfer, a process by which microbes can directly exchange genetic material, further spurred evolution. Imagine if they could share entire packages of beneficial traits, the ability to photosynthesize, the ability to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere, or resistance to poisons. Valuable genes were passed not only from parent to offspring, but also between completely different species. Evolution didn't wait for the emergence of complex organisms. Even then, it used all available means to create effective survival strategies. Peering into this era is an incredibly challenging task for paleontologists. The fossil record of those times is almost empty. Microbes were too fragile. Their bodies, lacking solid parts, disappeared without a trace, dissolving after death. However, they left behind other evidence, chemical and biological traces that, like shadows of the past, tell us about what was happening on the planet in those immemorial times. Specific molecules, such as hopanoids or steranes, serve as biomarkers, indicating the presence of specific bacterial groups. Analyzing stable isotope ratios in rocks can reveal which organisms were photosynthesizing, which were processing sulfur, and which were fixing atmospheric nitrogen. Rocks preserve the memory of ancient life, even if not a speck of dust remains of the cells themselves. Sometimes, in miraculously preserved layers of ancient mats or sediments, scientists manage to discover physical traces. Microscopic filaments, clusters of cells, their mineralized membranes. These aren't photographs, of course, but these tidbits of information allow us to form a picture of a world teeming with life, even if that life has long since died out. None of these creatures had a face, but their ecosystem was completely coherent and self-sufficient. Primary producers, photosynthetic organisms, created energy-rich organic molecules. Consumers disassembled them, and decomposers completed the cycle, returning the elements to the cycle. It was a complete food chain, but devoid of physical struggle. There were no jaws to tear flesh, no chase. Only the silent movement of molecules through layers of silt and water, and time flowed completely differently here. Without a complex nervous system, there was no consciousness, no memory, no ability to plan for the future. Cells simply responded to external stimuli in real time, obeying the laws of chemistry. Signal, change, reaction. Such was the unwavering rhythm of their existence, and for all its apparent simplicity, this system was phenomenally stable. It lasted for over 1 billion years. It experienced no global collapses or mass extinctions as we know them. Of course, the planet changed. New types of metabolism emerged, oxygen levels fluctuated, the climate shifted, but the microbial biosphere adapted each time. It was virtually indestructible. Its power over the world was total. It filled every crack, every drop of water and transformed every molecule. One might think this entire era was merely a drawn-out prelude, a slow preparation for the entrance of more significant actors. But evolution doesn't work that way. It has no final destination or finish line. The microbial world wasn't in a holding pattern, waiting for attention or for something to sprout legs and develop intelligence. It was completely self-sufficient and incredibly successful by its own standards. Many of the microorganisms that dominated then are still with us. Some have changed little for billions of years. Their direct descendants live within us, in the soil beneath our feet, and in every liter of ocean water. Others gave rise to entirely new forms of life: eukaryotes, multicellular organisms, and, eventually, animals. However, at this point in time, the Proterozoic era, that future wasn't even on the horizon. This was their time, a time of a world built by cells too small to be seen. They forged mighty chemical empires, thriving without sight, without sound, and without what we would call intelligence. And yet, they were the most influential force on the planet. The reign of microbes wasn't just enduring, it was fundamental. And so, in one of the quiet corners of this invisible world, something new was born. Something with its own command center. A nucleus. Their emergence was neither sudden nor dramatic. There was no splitting of the heavens or ancient flag planted in the mud. Eukaryotes, the cells from which all plants, animals, and fungi would one day be built, emerged almost unnoticed. Like many other great events of the Proterozoic, their ascent was not meteoric. It occurred slowly, gradually, and its details are still shrouded in mystery. However, when they finally emerged on the scene, it was a turning point in the history of life, marking a break with everything that had come before. A eukaryotic cell is more than just a membrane-bound bubble of cytoplasm. It's a veritable miniature city, divided into districts, organized and internally specialized. At its very center is the nucleus, where the precious DNA is safely ensconced behind an additional membrane. Within the cytoplasm, organelles, tiny structures, work, each performing its own unique function. Mitochondria, like power plants, generate energy. The endoplasmic reticulum, like an assembly line, processes proteins. And the cytoskeleton, like scaffolding, maintains shape and guides movement. This is no longer just a bag of chemicals. It's a complex system with transport flows, logistics, storage facilities, and control centers. Nothing like this existed in the Old World. By comparison, prokaryotes, bacteria, and archaea seem ingeniously simple, efficient, yet extremely simplified. Their DNA floats freely within the cell. All chemical reactions occur wherever the conditions are right, without strict localization. And this simplicity worked. It worked for billions of years. But eukaryotes chose a completely different path. They relied on internal complexity. How exactly this happened remains the subject of heated scientific debate. But the leading theory points to a remarkable alliance: symbiosis, a kind of ancient fusion pact. According to this idea, at some point in the distant past, an ancient host cell engulfed a bacterial partner, not as food, but as an ally. Perhaps this bacterium learned to live inside the host, gaining protection from the hostile outside world. Or perhaps it offered something valuable in return. For example, the incredible ability to efficiently use oxygen to produce energy. Whatever the precise circumstances, this partnership proved incredibly successful. The guest bacterium remained inside forever, eventually losing its independence, shedding its superfluous genes, and transforming into a specialized organelle. Eons later, it became. This is how it evolved into what we know today as mitochondria. This was far from the first partnership in the history of life, but it was undoubtedly one of the most fateful. Imagine that a tiny cell suddenly acquired its own nuclear reactor, a new energy center capable of producing colossal quantities of ATP, the very molecules that serve as the universal fuel for all life. This incredible surge of energy opened the door to entirely new possibilities. thanks to this energetic abundance, genomes had the chance to become larger and more complex. Control of cellular internal processes reached a new level of efficiency. The very possibility of cellular specialization, fine regulation, and the creation of complex internal frameworks arose. All of this ultimately allowed life to begin experimenting with the creation of astonishing and diverse forms. From the perspective of the great drama of evolution, this was a powerful impetus for renewal, not predetermined, but changing everything. Let's travel back to that ancient world. The earliest life forms, known to us as prokaryotes, were lonely wanderers, single-celled creatures without any complex structures. They had no brains to think with, no limbs to move, not a single recognizable feature we recognize today. But they were brimming with hidden potential, and this potential began to burst forth, triggering a process of diversification. Some of them took the next step, becoming multicellular. The ancestors of modern algae, as well as those lineages that would evolve into fungi and animals in the distant future, took completely different paths, exploring ever new forms of existence. Many of these evolutionary experiments proved short-lived and reached dead ends, for evolution is a process built on countless failures. However, some genera managed to survive and establish themselves, and over time, the vast tree of eukaryotic life became ever more lush and branched. It's important to understand that this period wasn't one of total dominance, but rather one of brilliant innovation. Eukaryotes weren't yet ruling the roost in the planet's ecosystems. They were bold newcomers to the microbial world, where ancient clans of bacteria and archaea still reigned supreme. But they began to play by entirely different rules. Some of them developed flexible membranes and, as a result, the incredible ability to engulf other cells whole. This paved the way for predation, a completely new way of interacting with the world. Life ceased to be simply a process of passively absorbing molecules from the environment. It began to hunt and devour other life. At first glance, this seems like a minor detail, but in reality, it was a tectonic shift. It generated colossal selection pressure, forcing some to develop defenses, while others refined attack methods, mobility, and detection capabilities. Eukaryotes didn't yet need eyes as we understand them, but they had already begun to adapt to this new reality. A pressing need to sense the world around them emerged, a fine chemical sense developed, the ability to respond to environmental cues, and the ability to purposefully move toward prey or flee from threats. All of this pushed life to begin, so to speak, thinking spatially. It was during this turbulent era that organisms began to develop far more complex relationships. Some became hospitable hosts for other symbiotic organisms. Entire groups of cyanobacteria were likely ingested but not digested at some point, becoming permanent guests. Over time, these symbionts evolved into chloroplasts, the very organelles that today supply all plant cells with solar energy. Once again, we see the same great process: cooperation, integration, and subsequent specialization. The fossil record, unfortunately, isn't particularly rich in details from those times, but we do have some clues. Microfossils with a more complex structure than bacteria begin to appear in Proterozoic rocks. They are larger and show signs of internal compartments. Chemical markers, such as traces of certain fats, indicate the presence of eukaryotic metabolism. While this evidence isn't always 100% conclusive, it aligns well with molecular genetic data, which suggests that by the middle of that distant era, eukaryotes had already diverged into their main lineages. These new, complex cells could be thought of as entire worlds in miniature. They carried layers of ancient history, their bacterial origins, even more ancient roots, and traces of incredible symbiotic fusions. Their complexity wasn't ingeniously engineered, but inherited, assembled from fragments of the past. There was nothing predetermined about it. However, this step opened doors that could never be closed. With vast reserves of energy, a high level of control, and a far richer genetic material, these cells were poised to create something entirely new. They began to form the first multicellular organisms. Of course, this didn't happen overnight. Hundreds of millions of years would pass before the first true animals of the Proterozoic era emerged, but the fundamental plan was already in place. The cell was no longer just a single building block. It had transformed into a highly complex system, ready for cooperation and further development. At that time, eukaryotes remained few in number, scattered across the oceans and in the overwhelming minority. But their incredible potential was already there. Their emergence was a turning point. Complexity had entered the great game of evolution, and it would take a very long time to reach the next heights. When some cells began to devour others, but instead of digesting them, they allowed them to live inside them, something extraordinary happened. What should have been a simple meal turned into a fateful partnership. Symbiosis, in its simplest definition, means living together. In the early Proterozoic, this cohabitation was not always voluntary, but it proved remarkably effective. One of the greatest results of this unplanned proximity was the emergence of mitochondria, the very structures that to this day supply energy to almost every eukaryotic cell on Earth, including ours. Mitochondria are often called the cell's power plants. However, this dry textbook phrase hardly conveys the entire epic history of these amazing organelles. Once upon a time, mitochondria were free-living bacteria. They likely belonged to a group of alpha proteobacteria that masterfully learned to use oxygen to generate energy. Their metabolism was perfectly adapted for a planet whose atmosphere was just beginning to become saturated with this life-giving yet dangerous gas. But instead of continuing its independent existence, one of these bacteria accidentally ended up inside another, larger cell where it remained forever. Scientists are still debating exactly how this happened. Some theories suggest that the host cell simply attempted to consume the bacterium in a process reminiscent of phagocytosis, viewing it as a potential food source. Others favor a more mutually beneficial alliance from the outset. Perhaps the host cell provided reliable protection, while the symbiotic bacterium shared excess beneficial chemicals. Whatever the case, the result was not death, but mutual adaptation. Over time, what began as a temporary cohabitation developed into an unbreakable alliance. The guest bacterium transferred most of its genes to the host cell's nucleus. It lost its former autonomy, lost the ability to live independently, and became completely dependent, but so did its host. In exchange, the host cell provided it with all the necessary resources, a safe haven, and complete control over reproduction. This process wasn't instantaneous, it stretched over millions of years, but gradually this united entity stabilized, and the mitochondria became an integral part of the cell, essentially a cell within a cell. This biological fusion was so complete and final that today most eukaryotic cells simply cannot survive without them. The mitochondria became the heart of cellular life. To this day, mitochondria retain living evidence of their bacterial past. They have their own circular DNA, separate from that found in the cell nucleus. These organelles reproduce independently, dividing in two in a manner strikingly reminiscent of the division of ordinary bacteria. Mitochondria are clad in double membranes. One of these, the inner one, is apparently a remnant of their original bacterial membrane, while the second, the outer one, is the result of that very ancient process of absorption into the host cell. Even their ribosomes and some proteins are more similar to those of bacteria than to those of their own host. This great merger was a turning point in evolution, not because it made prokaryotes more interesting, but because it made them immeasurably more powerful. The process of aerobic respiration, that is, oxygen-based respiration, used by mitochondria produces tens of times more energy from a single glucose molecule than ancient anaerobic methods. This energy jackpot allowed cells to dramatically increase in size. They were able to maintain highly complex internal structures and seamlessly replicate vast amounts of DNA, paving the way for further complexity. Cells armed with mitochondria are capable of producing far more proteins and performing far more complex functions. The energy provided by mitochondria made complexity economically viable and sustainable. But the role of mitochondria isn't limited to metabolism. They also had enormous ecological significance. Cells with mitochondria were able to harness more resources from the environment, learned to efficiently utilize oxygen, and eventually became completely dependent on it. They were able to form new types of communities, interact with each other in novel ways, and create unique multicellular structures. A single accidental ingestion of one bacterium by another paved the way for the emergence of the entire grandiose tree of complex life on Earth. Some eukaryotes went even further and formed new symbiotic alliances that would later give rise to algae and plants. Another crucial fusion occurred when a photosynthetic cyanobacterium was engulfed and retained within the cell. This event, independent of mitochondrial interaction, led to the emergence of the chloroplast, an organelle responsible for capturing sunlight and producing energy from it. Like mitochondria, chloroplasts became a key element that changed the course of life on our planet. Mitochondria, those amazing structures inside our cells with their own DNA, double membranes, and ancient bacterial origins, are a living monument to this process. Symbiosis, once considered merely a curious biological detail, is now recognized as one of the primary driving forces behind key evolutionary leaps. It's not just a survival strategy, it's a creative, constructive force. Instead of destroying other life, early eukaryotes incorporated it into their own world. Instead of rejecting outsiders, they made them part of themselves, and, in the process, completely rewrote the rules of what living cells are capable of. The story of mitochondria's origins also challenges our conventional notions of eternal competition. It turns out that evolution is not only a merciless struggle of all against all, but also the great art of integration and cooperation. In the great drama of evolution, victory does not always go to the fiercest or the most agile. Sometimes the key to success lies in the ability to create alliances and live in harmony. Consider this. Even today, every cell in our body carries the legacy of such an ancient alliance. We're talking about mitochondria. Every aspect of our existence, from muscle contraction and nerve impulse transmission to reproduction and even aging, directly depends on the functioning of these tiny power plants. The efficiency of each cell, its ability to conserve energy. All this is thanks to ancient bacterial structures that were once independent organisms. Imagine mitochondria as the descendants of those very same ancient bacteria. When these microscopic power plants fail, the entire system begins to malfunction and collapse. But when they work harmoniously and efficiently, life flourishes in all its glory. They are not just an appendage, not some secondary detail. They are the fundamental basis of our entire biology, and yet, in a sense, they still remain separate beings. Each mitochondrion stores its own tiny genome, a kind of molecular echo, a fossil from that distant era when it was a free, independent organism. Sure, it's not conscious, it doesn't remember its past or that fateful moment of absorption, but its lineage remains. Every mitochondria in the body of every animal, every plant leaf or mycelial strand, is a direct descendant of that ancient bacterial partner. More than 1 billion years ago, it made a choice, not to conquer another cell, but to cooperate with it. In the microscopic world of the Proterozoic, this choice seemed insignificant. It left no visible trace in the geological record, but it set off a chain reaction of increasing complexity. Cells grew larger, their internal components learned to interact, setting the stage for the great explosion of life long before it began to conquer the planet. Meanwhile, the planet itself was changing beyond recognition. Let's fast forward to roughly the second half of the Proterozoic era. Geologically, the Earth remained unchanged. Its core continued to churn, volcanoes spewed lava, and the continents, slowly but surely, continued their eternal drift. However, the climate had undergone truly catastrophic changes. For reasons that remain the subject of scientific debate to this day, our planet began to inexorably plunge into the icy embrace of global glaciation. Ice, like a white shroud, began to advance from the poles, moving ever closer to the equator. Temperatures dropped with each millennium, and the oceans, once warm, were encased in meters-thick ice. At one point, Earth may have looked more like Jupiter's icy moon Europa than the blue cradle of life we know today. And this wasn't just another ice age. During the Proterozoic era, at least twice, and perhaps more often, the planet experienced glaciations of unprecedented scale and severity. Ice covered most of the surface. It encased not only the polar caps and mountain peaks, but also reached lower latitudes, even encompassing regions near the equator. Shallow tropical seas and entire continents were hidden beneath the icy shell. Scientists use a special term to describe this phenomenon: Snowball Earth, or superglobal glaciation. Our planet encased in an icy shell. Debates about how widespread this glaciation was continue to this day. But one thing is certain: something extraordinary occurred. We find evidence of this ancient catastrophe right in the rocks. Glacial deposits from that era are found in places where, according to the logic of the modern climate, they should not be. Imagine, huge boulders frozen into a glacier travel thousands of kilometers, and then, when the ice melts, fall to the ocean floor, trapped in layers of fine sediment. Such stones are found in ancient marine sediments that formed far from today's polar zones. Exposed rocks in regions considered warm today reveal deep furrows, scars left by advancing glaciers. All this geological evidence paints a picture of a world where cold reigned almost everywhere. What could have triggered such a deep freeze? There's no definitive answer. Our planet's climate is a delicate balance of many factors: the amount of sunlight, the composition of the atmosphere, ocean currents, and the reflectivity of the surface. During the Proterozoic, our sun was younger and dimmer, emitting approximately 6% less energy than it does today. This fact alone made Earth more vulnerable to colder temperatures. The atmosphere also played a key role. At the beginning of the Proterozoic, methane was an important greenhouse gas that trapped heat. But as atmospheric oxygen levels rose, largely due to the activity of cyanobacteria, methane began to be actively destroyed by chemical reactions. Carbon dioxide, of course, remained, but its concentration could also decrease due to rock weathering or biological activity. As a result, the planet's thermal blanket thinned, opening the way to cold. And as soon as ice began to form on the surface, a chain reaction was triggered that only accelerated the descent into icy hell. Snow and ice perfectly reflect sunlight, unlike the dark surface of the ocean or land, which absorb it. The whiter the planet became, the less heat it retained. Temperatures continued to drop, and ice accumulated. It was a vicious cycle, a true climate loop, and once it reached a tipping point, it was impossible to stop. The result was global, or nearly global, glaciation. Understanding what happened to life during this harsh time is much more difficult. Very few fossils have survived from that era. The entire biosphere was microbial. Those most affected were likely the inhabitants of shallow waters, photosynthetic mats, and early eukaryotes. The oceans, covered in a thick layer of ice, blocked sunlight, cutting off access to their main energy source. But life didn't give up. Some of it may have found refuge in cracks in the ice, near geothermal vents on the ocean floor, or in rare, isolated pockets of open water. These places became the last strongholds where the flame of life flickered. Perhaps some organisms learned to enter a kind of hibernation, waiting out unfavorable conditions, but life didn't die out completely. Microbes demonstrated remarkable resilience and adapted to the new reality. Anaerobic organisms, which do not require oxygen, continued their quiet work in the bottom sediments. Hydrothermal vents, those underwater volcanoes, were bustling with life powered by chemical energy. Even photosynthesis likely continued in thin layers of ice, penetrated by dim light, or in small pools of meltwater on the surface of glaciers. However, over time, something began to change. The Ice Age couldn't last forever. Volcanic activity continued beneath the ice cap. The Earth's interior continued to spew carbon dioxide. But with most of the planet frozen, the natural mechanisms for removing this gas from the atmosphere virtually stopped. Weathering processes slowed, and the absorption of CO2 by microorganisms dropped sharply. Millennia after millennia, the gas accumulated, gradually intensifying the greenhouse effect. Temperatures began to creep upward, and as the planet warmed, the ice began to melt. Slowly at first, then faster and faster. The oceans opened up to the sun again. Sunlight once again touched the surface of the water. The air became more humid. The icy world began to crumble. This awakening was not peaceful. The end of the Snowball Earth era was likely accompanied by a series of violent cataclysms, sharp climate fluctuations and rapid warming. Acid rain, caused by volcanic gases dissolving in the atmosphere, lashed the exposed land. Melting glaciers caused colossal floods. A flood of nutrients poured into the oceans, leading to an explosion of microbial life. A period of extreme ecological instability ensued, but with it came new opportunities. Chemical weathering of the ice-free land resumed with renewed vigor. Oxygen levels rose again, and ecosystems were completely rebuilt. It was in the wake of these extreme shifts that the foundation was laid for the emergence of more complex multicellular life. Events like Snowball Earth can be viewed as natural disasters on a planetary scale. By all indications, they were catastrophic. Severe ecological stress, potential mass extinction, and a complete disruption of global cycles. However, they may also have had a constructive effect. Perhaps these crises cleared stagnant ecosystems, freed up ecological niches, and spurred evolution toward innovation. As a result, new paths of development that were previously impossible were opened up. The Proterozoic was never an era of calm and stagnation. Yes, it had long, quiet periods, but it also experienced chaos, global oxygen poisoning, atmospheric upheavals, and, as we can see, extreme cold. And each time, life survived, sometimes with great difficulty, but it never stopped. The cold could not destroy all life. It merely narrowed its possibilities, forced life into rigid boundaries, but it did not wipe it off the face of the planet. Beneath the thick, glittering armor of global ice, evolution continued its invisible labor. Life on Earth found ways to survive, demonstrating not so much resistance as astonishing persistence. The Snowball Earth periods were among the most severe ecological crises in the history of our planet, but they did not lead to complete apocalypse. They became a kind of evolutionary bottleneck, through which only the most resilient, the simplest, or the most adaptable organisms could survive. The Earth's surface at that time was practically unrecognizable. Continents were buried beneath kilometer-thick glaciers, and the oceans were encased in a sheet of ice. Icy winds howled in the thin, dry air, and temperatures plunged to unimaginable depths below freezing. Photosynthesis, the primary driver of most ecosystems, had almost completely stopped. The dim light of the young sun barely reached the Earth, and even the small amount that reached the surface was immediately reflected back into space by the glowing ice. But despite these horrific conditions, the planet wasn't dead. Hidden away in the depths of the ice-bound ocean, life continued. Heat from the Earth's depths warmed the deepest layers of water. Hydrothermal vents, these volcanic oases on the seafloor, continued to spew mineral-rich streams, creating pockets where chemically powered life thrived. Here, in the eternal darkness and under immense pressure, microorganisms, long adapted to the extreme conditions, continued their eternal cycle. Here, in the eternal darkness of the ocean depths, life continued its journey, seemingly oblivious to the icy apocalypse above. These amazing communities played by entirely different rules. They didn't require sunlight, the basis of life above. No, their fuel was not photosynthesis, but chemosynthesis. Instead of drawing energy from light, these organisms triggered chemical reactions, oxidizing hydrogen sulfide, methane, and other substances to fuel themselves. The bacteria at the base of these dark food chains were incredibly resilient, hardy, and completely unfazed by the planet's frozen surface. They had their own world, their own laws, and these laws continued to operate even in shallow waters, beneath kilometers of ice. However, even in this icy kingdom, things weren't so clear-cut. Some scientific models paint a picture where, even at the peak of glaciation, there could have been openings for life on the surface. Imagine thin cracks in the ice, or even entire patches of open water, so-called polynyas. These were veritable oases of life in the midst of an icy desert, tiny refuges that stubbornly refused to freeze. They were protected by powerful allies, tireless winds, warm ocean currents, and even heat emanating from the very depths of the planet. In these saving zones, microbes capable of photosynthesis could snatch a precious sip of light. While brief, while half-hearted, this tiny chance was enough to survive. Beneath the ice sheet itself, another world may have lurked. Imagine a layer of liquid water sandwiched between the ocean below and the giant glacier above. It was a twilight, viscous boundary where temperatures clung desperately to just above freezing. Microscopic life could find refuge, clinging to the rough underside of the ice, or swimming in the salty channels that ran through this icy mass. We can still observe similar ecosystems today beneath Antarctica's ice shelves, where microbes thrive in near-total darkness and near-freezing temperatures. But on land, a completely different picture unfolded. Icebound continents turned into lifeless deserts. No plants, no soil, no animals, just an endless blanket of white, beneath which it seemed nothing could live. However, even here, life found a way. Microbes likely escaped by burrowing deep into the rock. These amazing organisms, called lithotrophs, can exist within rock, protected from deadly radiation and the cold of space. They required negligible resources to survive. Today, we find their descendants in the harshest places on the planet, in the dry valleys of Antarctica and kilometers underground. Their metabolism is incredibly slow. They may only divide once every few years, but they are alive. But there was another path, another survival strategy. Instead of fighting the cold, some microorganisms decided to wait it out. They plunged into the deepest suspended animation, transforming into spores, cysts, and other highly durable forms capable of surviving millennia in unbearable conditions, biding their time. It's likely that the very first eukaryotes, the complex cells that were our distant ancestors, adopted precisely this tactic. They hibernated during the harshest frosts, preserving their fragile internal structures, only to awaken again when light and warmth returned to the planet. It was a strategy of waiting, not fighting. Evolution doesn't always favor the strongest and most aggressive. In times of great upheaval, it often favors the tiniest, the simplest, and the most patient. Cells capable of slowing their metabolism to a crawl and surviving on starvation had a far better chance of surviving the icy apocalypse. But then, the eternal winter began to recede. The ice broke, and with a deafening crack, the planet's icy shackles fell. As the oceans breathed freely again, a veritable feast for the survivors gushed forth from their dark depths. These were waters brimming with nutrients that had been pent up there for eons. The minerals that the glaciers had scraped from the continents and locked away at the bottom now mingled with the photosynthetic organisms that had come back to life. This created the perfect conditions for an evolutionary explosion. The zone where sunlight began to penetrate again became a seething cauldron of microbial life. Photosynthesis resumed with unprecedented force, and the atmosphere began to rapidly become oxygenated. The world after the Ice Age was chaotic, sharp warming, massive erosion, and the chemical composition of the oceans changing before our eyes. But for those who survived the darkness and cold, it was a time of rebirth. New energy sources emerged, countless ecological niches became available, and the number of competitors plummeted. For prokaryotes that had adapted, whether at hydrothermal vents, in meltwater pools, or awakening from long hibernation, incredible prospects for development opened up. It is in the rock layers, lying directly above layers of glacial sediment, that paleontologists find some of the oldest fossils of multicellular organisms. This was the emergence of an entirely new level of life organization. Cells learned to work together, forming single bodies and interacting in ways previously unimaginable in the microbial world. It's not that the cold gave birth to multicellularity, but perhaps it was this very global crisis that created the ideal conditions for its triumph. Survival during the Ice Age wasn't about battling the elements, but about adapting, hiding, slowing down, and hiding. And when the ice finally retreated, these silent victors emerged from the shadows, forever changed and ready to reshape the entire biosphere. The glacier didn't destroy life. It merely focused it, like a lens. It became the ultimate test of endurance, honing the survival tools that would soon create more complex, diverse, and wondrous creatures. And while life in the Proterozoic era desperately struggled against glaciers and cataclysms on the surface, the Earth itself never stopped moving beneath it. Although the continents appeared dead and silent deep within, they were in constant, monumental motion. In the world of geology, there is no room for haste. Here, everything is measured not in days or years, but in millions of years. But behind this slowness lies an invincible, inexorable force capable of changing the face of an entire world. And while ice storms raged on the surface, beneath the cover of microbial life and frozen seas, this great silent process continued. Crustal plates drifted across the face of the planet, creating entirely new conditions for the development of life. Drawn by the heat of the mantle and guided by invisible flows of molten rock, continents slowly floated across the planet. And this movement was not random. It had its own rhythm, like a majestic dance that lasted hundreds of millions of years. Tectonic activity, of course, began long before the Proterozoic, back in the Archean era. But it was by the beginning of the Proterozoic that this process reached maturity. The continents became thicker and more robust. So-called cratons, the oldest and most stable sections of continental crust, formed. These rocky hearts of the continents were incredibly resistant to erosion and deformation. Over time, they collided with one another, broke apart, and reunited, forming ever larger landmasses. This was an era of repeating cycles of the assembly and breakup of giant continents. The era of supercontinents has arrived. The idea itself is quite simple. Imagine a time when almost all the planet's landmasses were united into a single colossal continent. However, the reality, as always, was more complex. Supercontinents didn't emerge overnight. They were gradually stitched together from individual blocks through multiple collisions. And their disintegration was an equally long and uneven process. It is believed that this pattern repeated itself repeatedly throughout the Proterozoic era. And each of these ancient giants played its own unique role in the evolution of our planet. The first such titan of this era, according to scientists, was a supercontinent named Columbia, though some researchers prefer to call it Nuna. It likely formed completely around 1.8 billion years ago. It was a patchwork of ancient cratons welded together by subduction zones, mountain building, and the slow but inexorable convergence of plates. Its precise contours are still a subject of debate, but we have strong evidence based on comparisons of ancient rocks, mineral belts, and magnetic data from modern continents. We know that in those distant times, Proto-North America, the Baltics, and part of Siberia were part of a single entity, the supercontinent Columbia. But, like all supercontinents before and since, Columbia didn't last forever. By their very nature, these giant land masses are geologically unstable. Imagine a giant blanket covering a pot of boiling water. Heat from the Earth's interior accumulated beneath the thick continental crust, unable to escape. Eventually, this excess heat caused giant cracks to form. The crust stretched, thinned, and finally tore apart. Magma surged upward, creating new ocean basins, and the continents once again drifted on their own. After the breakup of Columbia and a long period of wandering, the age of a new giant arrived, Rodinia, which emerged approximately 1.1 billion years ago. This supercontinent had a completely different configuration. According to one theory, its center was the future North America, surrounded by South America, Africa, Australia, and Antarctica. However, the exact positions of all these parts still generate heated debate among geologists. One thing is clear: throughout Earth's history, supercontinents have been born and died, each time radically changing the face of our planet. Rodinia was truly enormous, and undoubtedly played a key role in shaping the climate and ocean currents of the Proterozoic. Its birth was accompanied by monumental mountain-building processes, such as the Grenville orogeny. The scars of these titanic collisions are visible in rocks to this day. These collisions gave rise to the highest mountain ranges, folded entire rock strata, and created vast metamorphic belts. Over time, these mountains were eroded, and billions of tons of sediment were carried into the surrounding ocean basins. It is in these deposits, like a stone record, that evidence of all the environmental and biological changes that occurred during that era is preserved. The existence of a supercontinent has a colossal impact not only on geography but also on the entire climate system of the planet. The gigantic landmass becomes a barrier to winds, completely redraws precipitation patterns, and alters the distribution of heat across the Earth. Rodinia, by uniting all the land masses, likely contributed to global cooling, which may have been one of the causes of the Great Glaciation with which we began our story.